Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another of our expanding cadre of shows and content here on the Radulich Broadcasting Network, Unsolved Wrestling Mysteries. I am your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm not wheezing tonight, Mr. Mark Radulich. This show, conceived literally hours ago, is an opportunity for myself and my co-host, who I will bring on momentarily, to look back at the history of professional wrestling and examine through evidence. We are an evidence-based practice podcast, ladies and gentlemen. We are a pair of detectives looking at the hard evidence for why certain situations, certain wrestlers, certain feuds mysteriously didn't work out as they should have. The world of professional wrestling and its history is littered with missed opportunities. And this podcast hopes to take a look at many of them. My co-host, I assume for the duration of this podcast, though I'm sure we'll have others, as we do with all of my shows, who will want to take part. The punch-in pugilist himself, and a man with a memory for wrestling knowledge like an elephant, Mr. Pat Mullin. How do you do, sir?
Aside from having terrible childhood flashbacks to the Unsolved Mysteries theme song that would horrify me as a child at 11 p.m. at night when it was on, I'm doing quite well.
This podcast was the brainchild of Pat and myself. One, because I am now obsessed with the Bruce Pritchard podcast on MLW radio. Pat hit me to it, and I said, well, I only like Jim Cornette. But he was like, no, give this a chance. You'll like it. And, Pat doesn't, Pat generally doesn't steer me wrong. He usually knows what he's talking about. He knows what I like and what I don't like. I don't know what, but I know what I like. And he was not wrong. I love the Bruce Pritchard podcast. And he did a show, which I thought was very fair, despite what his personal opinions might have been, about the Ultimate Warrior's history, who we'll be talking about tonight. And it had me thinking about what might have been. Because when you look at the Ultimate Warrior, now I'm famously a fan of this particular wrestler, just as I am a fan of Goldberg and a fan of the Ultimate Warrior. Famously on the Casual Heroes, I drafted all three, and everyone went, because neither of those three gentlemen are known for their work rate, though Brock's not bad. But I am not just about work rate. I am about presentation. And if there's one thing the Ultimate Warrior had over many of his contemporaries, and really a lot of folks for years on end, was presence. So when I look at his history of why his title reign, which he picks up the belt in 1990 from Hulk Hogan and then unceremoniously drops it to Sergeant Slaughter in January of 91, the question is asked, why didn't his title reign work out better? Why didn't it draw more? Why wasn't he more successful Why did they seemingly abort his title reign so soon after he won the damn thing? Again, April of 1990, January of 91. And that's without even getting into his subsequent firing at SummerSlam years later, and then the nonsense that would ensue even after that. So, as we were talking about it off air, Pat and I realized that, this would actually make for a very interesting live discussion, because there's a lot of data to comb through as far as his title run goes. And we would get sidetracked in talking about Ric Flair and some of these other folks, and we realized that if you look at the data for a lot of these situations where it's seemingly, how could a can't-miss situation miss so badly, the answers became quite clear. And then the real fun for us was figuring out how they could have righted the ship. And so that's what this podcast is. We're going to look at the data. We're going to present the situation. We're going to look at the data. And then we're going to pitch what might have been, how they could have fixed the situation. And tonight, as I said, we're going to focus on the Ultimate Warrior's 90 through 91 title run. My premise, and I'm going to shut up after this and let Pat talk. My premise here is that after winning the title at WrestleMania 6, the Ultimate Warrior could have had a 2-year-ish solid, profitable title run at the top of the card, had a number of tweaks been made and situations been corrected in terms of his booking. And we'll go into all the details of that. My contention is this, and I want to get Pat's opinion on it before we deep dive into the data, that Warrior should have held the title from Mania 6 until the build for Mania 8, which then should have been Hogan versus Flair. So Warrior should have held on to the title through Mania 7, held it through the remaining of 91, and then going into 92, maybe dropping it at the Rumble and building towards Hogan versus Flair. And the Hogan versus Flair that never happened at WrestleMania 8 is its own unsolved wrestling mystery show at a later date. So, Pat, that's where we're going to begin tonight. My premise is there was a solid 2-year run that was an entirely missed opportunity for the Warrior. Agree or disagree?
I agree. I think we should preface this a little bit, too, by saying that we kind of did a show that people may think we have already done this show. We did a show called In Defense of the Ultimate Warrior with Gavin Napier a few years back. And really, it's a good companion piece if you're listening to this show to download and listen to as well. Basically, that was more defense of the general character assassination that Warrior tends to, at times, depending on what's said, fairly or unfairly receive. And, this show is going to be more about the potential of what he could have achieved as the WWF champion if things had gone a little bit differently in terms of booking and writing and certain events that caused bad feelings and an attitude problem and things of that nature. But if you really want a full companion piece, we'll touch on some things that we touched on in more detail on our previous podcast called In Defense of the Ultimate Warrior,
which is here in the archives on the Radulich Broadcasting Network. Yes, this one's going to go into more detail than that one did. And we're not going to necessarily get into a lot of the nonsense that went on. More of there were missed booking opportunities. That's what we want to focus on. So, all right, we know the premise now. And I'm going to, as quickly as I can here, and I do have some notes. I've got notes. Here's what happened. And then I'm going to pitch it to Pat here to sort of, talk about the finer points of the timeline. But here's a rough timeline of everything that happens between 88 and 91. '88 is the year that the Ultimate Warrior wins the IC belt. It's a great place to start because it's from '88 to '90 that build him up, in theory, to be the guy. I don't.
And
know
I was
when,
there.
I don't know when Vince and company decided that they were going to anoint the Warrior, but if you're just looking at how they built him up to be Hogan's opponent in 1990 in Toronto, it begs the question, what were they thinking? Because, I mean, if you think about how they build people up now to look like a threat against somebody, it's miles apart from how they started, in my opinion. And, Pat, you feel free to cut me off and say, well, I disagree with that if you do. But when I look at how they've started with him, it's miles apart from a lot of what they do now. You know, they talk about, they strapped a rocket to this guy's ass. Not in 1988. Yes, they handed him the belt. A very famous SummerSlam incident where, you know, he runs down, beats the Honky Tonk Man in 30 seconds, and walks off, you know, into the night with the IC strap. And you're thinking, my God, what else did you want to do with the guy? Let's look at 1988 as a whole. All right? Because despite winning the belt, this was a crap year for the guy. First of all, he's not just crushing the Honky Tonk Man and looking like $1 million. He spends most of the year just crushing jobbers, or as they are called today, enhancement talent. And he's trading wins. You know, they talk about the deficit of wrestling today is the nature of the 50-50 booking in the WWE. Well, they were doing it in 1988 too, because he's trading wins with the Honky Tonk Man, and he's working a lot of dark matches. So, like, on TV, he's crushing jobbers, but when the cameras are turned off, him and the Honky Tonk Man are going back and forth and a lot of 50-50. There was also a lot of DQ finishes. Real quick, Pat, I asked you this offline. I want you to address it online. Why was the WWF at the time so in love with DQ finishes, especially in situations where they really didn't have to protect the opponent?
A lot of it has to do with their schedule at the time, which was really ambitious. At the time, up until mid-1990, it was commonplace for the WWF to be running 3 shows on the same day in different venues. You'd have your A-level show, which is usually your world champion, or your real hot TV angle, your B show, which would either be your intercontinental or tag team champions, and then your C show, which is like 1 or 2 real legitimate names and a bunch of lesser known, you know, lower level opening card match guys and some local guys. So part of it is because they're running all these houses and they want numbers at all of them, they were trying not to outright job guys in these matches so that if there was a chance they needed this guy in a scenario on a B or a C show to draw some money, their stock wouldn't totally be damaged. And because the market was shifting more towards a pay-per-view kind of revenue stream and really doing a lot of money and a lot of live attendance gates based on your bigger shows that were hyped, they wanted to kind of save clean finishes so that they meant more on those shows. And you'll see when we go over some numbers later that was probably a really bad idea in retrospect, but we'll get to that bridge when we come to it. And it was a matter of, at that time, the booking committee, it wasn't really the committee in the true sense of the word so much as it was you had Vince, you had Pat Patterson, Jay Strongbow, and Terry Garvin. Ultimately, Vince made the call. He would heavily receive input from Pat Patterson, and on shows that they were not on, Jay Strongbow ran a lot of those, and because Strongbow had his own agenda at times, there were guys he just didn't like and didn't want to see go over, but were supposed to, so he ended up changing a lot of finishes to disqualifications and countouts or non-finishes where it ended up in a double countout or a draw or what have you.
So you can see where, and Pat really alluded to it, that if you're a paying fan casual fan of the WWF at this time, and you go see a live event, and it's just chock full of BS, lots of DQ finishes and countouts and nonsense. After a while, if that's the sort of plates they're serving up, you might get turned off. If you're trying to draw people to a house, but the only time you get to see a clean finish in a decent match is at the pay-per-view or a Saturday night's main event, you might come to the conclusion, hey, fuck these people.
You can understand that type of booking if they're doing, a main event angle in that, particular venue, especially if it's a larger venue like a Madison Square Garden, a Boston Garden, a Philadelphia Spectrum, a lot of their regular, territorial strongholds. And let's say it's the first time you're matching up, we'll use Hulk as an example because he had been the stalwart. It's the first time a Hulk is going to work a match with Randy Savage. Well, you want to see how this draws, and if it draws well, the advanced ticket sales, you're going to say, we could come back with this match and do it again. So maybe you do a DQ finish or a count out for that match. Do you really need a disqualification finish, 4 matches lower on the card between Tito Santana and the Honky Tonk Man?
Right. Corporal Kirshner and Nikolai Volkov. Fucking count out. Why? So 1988 for the Ultimate Warrior pretty much consists of a feud with Hercules, which is significant. I'll tell you why in just a moment. Weasel suit matches with the late, great Bobby Heenan. And
he's not late. He's still alive.
Oh, is he? Is he still kicking? I thought we lost Heenan. We'll leave most.
No, but
he's mostly gone.
now that we mention it, let's send condolences to the families of Chavo Guerrero Sr. and George the Animal Steele, who we lost today, and Chavo a few days ago.
Yes. George the Animal Steele, despite, looked like my grandfather, actually. Looked like everyone's grandfather. Hell of a talent, lived a great life. I hope a small George the Animal Steele trivia note. He's the only man to challenge Bruno Sammartino, Pedro Morales, Bob Backlund, and Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship. Good for him. All right, so we have the Ultimate Warrior in a feud with Hercules, not exactly a technical masterpiece. We have Weasel suit matches with Bobby Heenan, and we finish off the year trading wins with the Honky Tonk Man, and then in between a lot of squash of jobbers.
And don't forget him getting squashed in 30 seconds by Andre.
Yes, of which there's a video that you should all check out. It's hilarious. I want to quick draw attention to the Hercules thing, because when we start getting to how could this been saved, how could there have been a better, more profitable run for the Warrior, it is important to note, and this isn't a knock on the guy, this is just fact, looking at the data. The Ultimate Warrior needs to work with people who can carry him through a match and guide him. The guy is a presence. He's a body. He is charisma personified. He is not a worker, not by a long stretch. He kind of made Hulk Hogan look like Chris Benoit. And Hogan's not exactly known as a technical masterpiece, as we know. But even Hogan could wind his way through a match with somebody who was at least halfway decent. Not so much the Warrior. So when you're matching the Warrior up, you want to put him with guys who are giving, who are technically sound, and very smart to the business, know how to construct a match. Not everybody has to be a technical whiz, but they should at least understand the art of pro wrestling in terms of match construction. Go ahead, Pat. I know you got
how to highlight Warrior's strengths without exposing him too much for where his limitations are. We talk about guys who aren't necessarily, your technical wizards, but an example of that who's not a technical wizard, but knew how to have a match with the Warrior that was presentable, that could go 10, 12 minutes, is a guy you mentioned that he wrestled and traded wins back and forth with the Honky Tonk Man. Honky is not a mat wizard in the vein of a Luthez. He's not a high spot guy. What Honky is an entertainer, And what he understands coming from his Memphis background is how to really manipulate and play a crowd with entertainment value. And that's why he was able to work, such an extended program with the Warrior, where a lot of guys, they can only have one kind of match with the Warrior, and that's why they get cut off pretty quickly from working with him.
So the Hercules Hernandez feud with the Warrior was ill-founded and ill-conceived from the start. Because on paper, it's the kind of match that makes Mark Radulich drool. It's two body guys. Hercules Hernandez, he looked good, man. He would carry that chain to the ring. If you don't know who he is, look him up. He had a good body on him. He had good presence, good charisma. He carried the chain to the ring. He looked like a brick shit house, and he fought like a man. And they put him in there with the Warrior, and it was like a kid taking two monster action figures and smashing them together for 5 minutes. Not exactly.
Ted DiBiase had always said that Herc was a good guy, and you could have a good match with him, but when you put Herc and the Warrior together, it became the blind leading the blind. Because even though Herc had an aptitude to learn, and Herc could have a good match with a guy who was leading it, he was still a body. And when you put two body guys together without either of them being a general, it doesn't usually pan out well. And Herc had been around at this point for a while and was, again, okay if you put him in with the general. Warrior is in 1988, his third full year in the wrestling business. And he came from, a couple territories where work rate wasn't a priority to begin with, and he never really learned that. So putting him in with Herc, while it looks really great on TV when they stand against each other, the matches were not really anything that was going to draw substantial interest after the first time you see it. And they had their match at WrestleMania 4. It was not part of the tournament. It was card filler, basically. And they have kind of a sloppy finish. It's okay for what it is, but that's about as good as it was ever going to get with those two.
And so why are we harping on this? Because this is the guy they're going to anoint in 2 years to be the man. And they're not giving him anything to work with. There's a grooming period that needs to take place with proper opponents, and they start him off in the bear trap. Putting him with Bobby Heenan in the Weasel Suit matches, depending on who you believe in those stories, as far as a concept goes, is great. Because Bobby Heenan should have smartened him up to the business, and those should have been very entertaining matches. Unfortunately, like I said, if you believe Bobby, who's probably not lying, the Warrior's a little thick and doesn't quite understand the showmanship part of wrestling, and a lot of the Weasel Suit matches are not as good as they could be. On the other hand, there needed to be somebody there that grab, other than Andre, that to grab Hellwig by the shoulders, shake him, and say, "Stupid, listen to Bobby so that he can make you better." These are important matches. I understand you think they're silly, but this is how you're going to learn and be a main event guy. And I don't know if anyone had that come to Jesus with him.
Well, sort of, but it didn't take. And we'll cross that bridge in about a year from this point in his career. But, working with Heenan, he probably saw it as demeaning because Bobby, again, is a manager. And when you're this, 6'2", 275-pound, ripped animal who is being told, "Hey, we've got plans for you. We're gonna do something with you," and they book you against the manager in a comedy match, and especially when you're not. And this is something we prefaced talking about him last time, but the Warrior is not a guy who grew up in what we call the cult of the wrestling business, where he is not, this is the end-all, be-all of my life. This is my job. I'm here 9 to 5. I'm here to make money so I can, have what I want to have in my life. And, when I have a family, I can give them what they want. This isn't going to dominate my life, and I'm not going to be a guy who lives, eats, breathes, sleeps this and doesn't have any life outside of it. And that's going to get you resentment from an old-timer like Heenan, who made his entire life out of this because he loved it. But it is what it is. And with the Warrior work in comedy matches, it's not something he's going to understand because he's not a fan and he's not familiar with this. And even though these matches, they did them in the AWA with Bobby and Greg Gagne, and they actually drew a lot of money because Heenan was so hated that people wanted to see him get his comeuppance. And, you know, that was the concept in doing these types of matches with Warrior. It was a way to get him over with the people because he was going to be dishing out, you know, embarrassment to the most hated heel manager on the roster. But because he didn't get it, the matches were very kind of blah, and they probably went away quicker than they wanted to.
Right. So let's move on to 1989, where he spends the first half of the year. Now, on the one hand, you could look at this and say, well, that's a good thing, because he spends half of it really being groomed by Savage. And if you're going to have a rabbi in your corner, a coach, smartening you up to the business, who better than Randy Macho Man Savage, one of the great workers of this golden age of wrestling? This is I don't remember if Savage is Savage is the champion around this time.
Yes.
So yes, this is going into WrestleMania 5, where the Mega Powers explode. So Savage is the champion, and they're doing a lot of dark matches. And Savage is working with Warrior, smartening him up, but the other side of that is Warrior's losing a lot of these matches. The other thing that's happening around this time is he's trading wins with Rick Rude and losing the belt to him. Okay? They have a match at WrestleMania 5, and he loses the IC belt to Rick Rude. This is important, okay? This is a very important key element to his success or failure a year later when he has the heavyweight title. So, again, he spends half of 89 losing to Savage and trading wins with Rude and ultimately losing the belt at Mania to Rude. Now, he'll get the belt back at SummerSlam in August, but if you are a longtime fan and you're watching this, a year later when they redux this feud, you're like, all right, they did him and Rude already, and Rude kicked his ass. So that's important. It's a very important brick in this whole wall of information. Savage and Rude, and it's not like he was dominant in either feud. The rest of the year. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, each of those matches that he was in, be it Savage or be it Rude, they were main eventing the arenas they were at. I mean, I have a couple of bootleg copies of him wrestling Savage at the Boston Garden in, I believe it is February of 1989. And what you have there is a match that's largely dominated by the Warrior, with Savage really doing his best to make the Warrior look good to the crowd. They can't make him win because they're building to Savage Hogan, so they have to keep the title on Randy. So what they do is they have Rude come down and intervene during the match and distract Warrior and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of Rude, they had a heel that they had kind of slowly built up the ladder since he made his debut with the WWF in 1987. Not really a far cry away from when the Warrior made his, and they were both coming from the same territory of World Class in Texas. So there was a familiarity there with them, and each of these guys was kind of being built up the card to eventually be main event players. And so I think they thought the development stage would be good for both of them to work together. There was a little bit of them working each other and against each other in Texas, and so they thought there was a chance there. Rude oozed charisma, phenomenal look, and he was another guy who people don't often understand was looked at as a body. Rude did not have a reputation as a worker until they put him in with the Warrior. And somehow, by some stroke of, you know, genius or luck or brilliance, Rude was pulling these excellent matches out of the Warrior, just, I guess, by virtue of his professionalism and wanting to have the best products possible, and knowing that, you know, these two guys are both being groomed for something bigger, that if they were able to really do something memorable and excellent, both their stocks would rise, no matter how hard Rick had to work to make it work, and he did. So while, yeah, he's not getting the wins on paper, but he's being made to look very good, and it's getting him over with the audiences.
Okay, don't get me wrong. I approve. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on 89, but 88. But 89, I'm fine with, at least the first half of it. Don't get me wrong. I'm okay with him working with ring generals like Savage and Rude. I'm even somewhat okay with the trading wins, especially in the case of him and Rude, because sometimes you got to do that in order to build up a good feud, and you address the television situation versus the live and the live events earlier in the conversation. What I'm saying is, once it's done, it didn't need to be redone, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. That doesn't mean I think it was bad when they did it the first time. I think what they're doing with this part of Warrior's career is actually excellent. It's just later on where I start to scratch my head and go, why are we doing it again, if you follow my meaning. However, after SummerSlam and Warrior gets the belt back from Rude, he spends the rest of the year feuding with Andre the Giant over the IC belt. As my notes here indicate, he mostly looks strong, and as far as finishes go, they're mostly clean pins. And you pointed out that Andre even let him slam him. So, at this point, if you're going to have a monster put the Warrior over and make him look like $1 million, Andre's a good person to do that with, especially at this stage of his career.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Again, Andre had his difficulties working with the Warrior, and the matches themselves, you can see there's a lot of points during them where there's a lot of lack of communication between the two of them. But regardless of that, what people walked away remembering about that is Warrior slammed Andre and Warrior beat Andre, and nobody was going over Andre with pinfalls like that except for Hogan.
All right, so now we move into 1990, and we're setting up here for WrestleMania 6 in Toronto. And we've got some Warrior versus Dino Bravo for the IC belt. If you don't know who Dino Bravo is, he's a French-Canadian. Is that right? Am I right about that?
Yes.
Okay, a big French-Canadian, muscly fellow. He had one of those muscle bodies, though, where he looked kind of puffy, at least in the years that I was familiar with him. I thought he looked great on TV. Might have been a little too hard on the gas. Either way, why don't you give 50 words or less on Mr. Dino Bravo and whether or not he was a good fit for the Warrior in this early part of 1990?
Yeah, Dino was a guy who was right in the mid-card and kind of 50-50 booked himself, never looked weak. They at least tried to promote him at times, doing the world bench press record during the Royal Rumble, and he was, they promoted him as the world's strongest man. So the strongman thing versus Warrior makes sense on paper. More interesting about Dino is his death. I won't spoil details of it, but just Google it. It's really mafia-esque, and it's a fun read if you're into that kind of stuff.
That's the most significant thing he does prior to WrestleMania 6. Now, he has the match with Hogan. There's a huge build to it. He does the bit with the pilots, which is hilarious. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just fucking Google, YouTube that
Assume the controls.
We actually played that on the podcast. He has a great match with Hogan. It's one of the few that I remember. I'm going to be 41 years old, and I can still remember how I felt watching WrestleMania 6 and being a lifetime Warrior fan and a Hogan hater, how happy I was when he finally, I know where I was, I know his house I was at, I know what we were doing that day. There are details I have lost over years. There are things that my wife has told me in the past week that I do not remember. But boy, do I remember every detail of WrestleMania 6, and as far as that match goes and the emotions around it. Loved his match with Hogan. And Hogan really did his part to make Warrior look good. Warrior played his role very well. It's a great feel-good moment in his career, and it starts off pretty well, and then there's nothing. that I could find on the list that I was looking at for this takes place in April, and there's nothing happening in May and June after Mania. Really auspicious start for the champ.
Yeah, he makes his first televised appearance as champion on Saturday Night Main Event. I believe it's about 2 weeks after WrestleMania. He wrestles a main event match with Haku. Good little TV match, to establish this is now the Warrior era. This is your champion. And they go ahead and even take Hulk off TV, which should have been a masterstroke to help Warrior establish himself, but they really fumble the ball on the play, which we'll talk about as far as why the booking of the Warrior failed and why it didn't necessarily have to. May and June, he does a lot of PR appearances because that was one of the strengths of Hulk when he first became the dominant figure in wrestling, not just the WWF, but wrestling. He was doing, Johnny Carson. He was doing the Jerry Lewis MDA telethon. He was on all these other talk shows, and he was on Sports Illustrated. He was in demand all over the place. The thing about it was with Hulk, it was organic. Hulk had friends like Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper and Sylvester Stallone, and all that media and overflow that formed the rock and wrestling connection was really very organic and well timed. Warrior had no such connections to any of that. He was a really private, not personable guy. And so when they tried to force him into these things, a lot of people didn't have a real awareness of who Warrior was at the time, not to knock him. He did the regular kind of WWF appearances like Regis's show because Regis was a huge wrestling fan, always liked to book WWF guys on the show, so he did that. He did a Phil Collins NBC special where he ends up wrestling Phil Collins to the tune of Two of Hearts. And that was kind of Warrior's whirlwind 2-month press tour that really didn't do anything to establish him as a crossover presence the way Hulk had done.
So I don't want to get into the what if yet because that's the second half of what we're going to do. There's an obvious choice that should have been made, and they do the exact opposite. But I will talk just briefly about some opportunities they could have had to follow up a strong WrestleMania. There's 2 opponents he wrestles, one in April, as Pat mentioned, and one in August in Japan. And either one of those should have been an immediate, prolonged follow-up feud to Hogan. King Haku and Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man. Ted DiBiase was elevated to the main event scene in roughly 1987 when he got involved in the Andre the Giant Hulk Hogan feud post-WrestleMania 3. If I'm wrong about one of those details, jump in here. But he
post-Survivor Series.
He became embroiled in that. He was instrumental in the title being vacated, setting up for WrestleMania 4. And again, Ted DiBiase was a mainstay of the main event scene, the previous couple of years. Not to mention he was a ring general. He was a guy who theoretically should have been able to pull great matches over an extended period of time with the Ultimate Warrior. So who better coming out of WrestleMania than to stick the Warrior in a prolonged feud with Ted DiBiase that either culminates in SummerSlam or at least sets up for another feud that culminates in SummerSlam. Instead, he does one match with Haku, who everything I just said about Ted DiBiase, just picture, the King versus the Warrior in an extended feud with the Heenan family. There was money to be made here, and they just dropped the ball. So whether they go Haku or Ted DiBiase, there was an opportunity here to really do something with the Warrior and follow up strong, and they just do nothing. And then they set up Rick Rude for SummerSlam. They have a match on Saturday night's main event that ends in a DQ. Everyone take a shot. And then they do Rick Rude versus the Ultimate Warrior for the World Heavyweight title at SummerSlam 90, which is the opposite the Hulk Hogan Earthquake match, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit because it pisses me off. But that whole thing just screams of, 1, missed opportunity, and 2, we've already done the Ultimate Warrior and Rick Rude. Why are we doing it again? And the rest of the year is a lot of nothing. It's him and the Road Warriors feuding with Demolition. That's it. That's the Warriors' big 1990 heavyweight title year. Nothing. Rick Rude, the Road Warriors, nothing. I'm shaking with frustration here. 91, as we come to a close here of what happened and why it happened. 91, he drops the title to Sarge, which builds towards WrestleMania 7 and the whole, the American hero versus the Iraqi sympathizer angle. And he starts a feud with Savage that culminates WrestleMania 7 in the retirement match, which I just made my kids watch, and there was some fun had with that. Posthumously, after WrestleMania 7, we build towards SummerSlam, and in between Mania and SummerSlam, money is owed, money is not paid, feelings are hurt, threats are made, and men are fired. And that is how the story ends with the Warriors' initial and only, I believe, heavyweight title run. And so we spent a lot of time in going through a lot of painstaking detail so that you would understand that when people say, oh, the Warrior didn't draw, what fucking favors did they do him so that he could draw? You know what I mean? We just went through.
And there's a lot of other circumstances we'll get into, too, besides just his general booking, talking about the shape of the company at the time.
Yeah. But I think at this point, before we trans into how this whole thing could have been saved, it's important to talk about what was going on in between Mania and SummerSlam. So they go ahead and they say, we need to find the next Hulk, right? We need to find the next Hulk. We need to anoint the guy. Hulk wants to take some time off. As Pat said, there's a master stroke of booking here where they're going to take Hulk off TV. And they bring in this guy, and I'm going to let Pat talk about him again, because when Pat talks about him, you could actually feel his pants get tighter, okay? Pat loves this guy. But he doesn't just love him. When we talk about a man who's smart to the business, can move like a worker, but looks like a monster, that man, now you youngins might only know him as a joke wrestler, but back in the day, he was the real deal. And that man's name was John Tenta, otherwise known as Earthquake, baby, Earthquake. Talk about it, Pat.
The late, great John Tenta, who had a tremendous athletic background, came from Vancouver, Canada, was a huge man, legitimate 6'8", weighed legitimately over 400 pounds, played football and wrestled at Louisiana State University, was a starting offensive lineman and was a super heavyweight wrestler, NCAA Division I. Didn't have a clear direction after college, was invited to Japan to train as a sumo. Became one of the higher-ranked foreigners to ever compete in that sport, which is a tremendous athletic achievement for those who don't know it, and was given the name Koto Tenzan as a tribute to him in Japan. Arguably one of the three most famous and successful gaijin foreigner sumos that has ever been to Japan and competed at their highest levels of sumo. John trained as a wrestler at a suggestion by Antonio Inoki. So in 86, I believe it was, he entered the New Japan dojo and trained the hard way when you're training in those Japanese dojos and getting tortured. Paid his dues working independents in areas like Vancouver, where he's from. Eventually gets a call to come to the WWF and debuts in an angle with the Ultimate Warrior, where Warrior is feuding with the aforementioned Dino Bravo, and they're going to have a push-up contest, and they're doing it, but they want to make it interesting. So they see this huge man in the audience who says his name is Big John. They call him into the ring. They tell him to sit on Bravo's back, and he'll do push-ups. And then they'll tell the Warrior's turn comes up, and he'll do push-ups. Well, he flattens the Warrior with what we've come to call the Earthquake Splash. And from that point on, he was initially billed as the Canadian Earthquake, came to be known as just Earthquake eventually, and kind of is kept in the background almost the way Braun Strowman was, to put it in perspective for, people who weren't around and watching and are watching now. He wasn't put at the forefront. He was a silent enforcer. He'd get involved in matches here or there, didn't get taken off his feet, didn't go down for a pinfall or loss, and was saved for something bigger. And in this case, it was an angle with Hulk Hogan, where when they're making a transition away from Hulk, they needed something to take Hulk off TV, allow him to do some other things like film a movie called Suburban Commando. And what they did was, on a segment of the Brother Love Show, starring our friend Bruce Pritchard, they had Earthquake attack Hulk from behind, hit him with 3 Earthquake splashes on the set, and have him neck braced and stretchered out, which had never been done to Hogan before. Hogan had letting guys hurt him before, like King Kong Bundy, like Andre. He never did a stretcher job where people were like, we might have seen the last of Hogan, to the point where they did get well cards, a 900 number to get updates. His friend, the Tugboat, was pleading with everybody to write him get well cards and letters that you could send to a P.O. box for Hulk. And really, they established Earthquake as a monstrous threat.
Now, the obvious, I guess this is where we should transition into what they should have done. I think going into, well, no, you know what? Let's back up a second. If they're going to decide in '88 with giving him the IC title that they're going to anoint him as the guy, they need to prep this guy. There's a WrestleMania in between, WrestleMania 5, where the Mega Powers explode, where they're going to put the title back on Hogan after giving it to Savage the year before. They've got from '88 to '90 to get Warrior in shape to take the baton from Hogan. And theoretically, as I said earlier, the Warrior should have solidly held that title until they started the build from to WrestleMania 8, which is in '91, for Hogan and Flair, which is where we're going to stop the bookend, because I think after that it would, there's no way to tell what would have happened after that, especially with the looming steroid trial in a few years, which is a whole other mess. So let's start transitioning into, we know what they did do, but what should they have done to groom the Warrior from his feud with the Honky Tonk Man in '88, where he gets the strap, to WrestleMania 6 in 1990? I'm going to pitch it to you, Pat. They got to set this guy up. Now, I'm going to set you up with a premise here. We talked about it earlier, but I'm going to let you fill in the blanks for me. Because after he gets the title, I've got some ideas of what they should have done. But getting there, that's where I'm going to lean on you a bit. They got to set this guy up with ring generals, mid-card ring generals that can groom him and give him a shine and make him look like, signal to the people, this is the second coming of Hulk Hogan. He's got the belt August of '88. What do you do?
The initial step, I think, is correct in having him do some rematches with the Honky Tonk Man. You can't have him go out there and do 30 seconds every time if you're going to expect him to, at some point, carry the load as your world champion. And Honky was good enough to get him through 10, 12-minute matches on the house show circuit, on Saturday night's main event. So I think step one is correct. Because not only do you have him squash him, but you also have him go through these matches and continually win to show that it's not an aberration or a fluke. He really beat the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time. There's something to this guy. Where they went next is immediately into Rick Rude. I don't have a problem with using that as your next big angle on TV. But on the house show loops, I think you need to put him with different guys besides Rude, who can open him up a little bit in terms of teaching him something that Rude not necessarily could have, because as we've established before, Rude wasn't known as a ring general. He was another body guy who was a little more athletic and in better cardiovascular shape, but not a real worker. So, I mean, you look at the WWF roster of guys in 1988, one name that people are going to throw, or 1989, excuse me, one name people are going to throw out at me is going to be Greg the Hammer Valentine. I'm going to tell you that that is a terrible mistake because there's a match available between the two from the Bradley Center in Milwaukee on the undercard of the February 89 main event where the Mega Powers finally turned on each other. That match is a terrible example of a veteran who doesn't want to put the new guy over and makes his shit look bad. Valentine really goes out of his way to bump crappy for the Warrior and not sell any of his offense well, and really begrudgingly does the job for him. So I'm going to immediately take Greg Valentine's name out of the running. The Savage feud is okay at your bigger houses, in my opinion, because you've got to build to WrestleMania. So you need to do something that's going to keep your houses up without giving away your main event prior to that show. So doing, Savage and the Warrior champion versus champion makes sense. And Randy being such a consummate pro is a really good choice to have him, build up and really learn a thing or two here or there. We brought up two names before that you thought were potential guys to help get him ready as champion for good feuds. One was Haku, who at this time in 1989 is still doing the King gimmick, and one is Ted DiBiase. I feel like Haku is the better option because Haku's in a position where if he does clean jobs to Warrior, it's not really hurting his brand. Haku would go on at WrestleMania 5 to do a clean job in the opening match to Hercules. So doing the honors for the Warrior as Intercontinental Champion who they're elevating isn't going to hurt him. Warrior is going to be in there with a guy who's capable of presenting a physical threat to him in the audience's eyes because of his size. He's a guy who had been in the business for enough years, worked enough different styles to know how to get the best possible match out of Warrior and teach him things that bigger guys closer to that 300-pound mark need to learn, pace themselves, and not blow up, which is a problem Warrior had throughout his career, where his ring entrance was so energetic and the guy looked phenomenal, but he wasn't, an athlete who did a lot of cardio training. So that sprint to the ring and shaking the ropes would have him, sucking wind before the opening bell. And I think Haku could have taught him a great deal about pacing, being a guy who was 6'3", 300 pounds in that range, and athletic. Haku could have really been an olive branch to teach him these things, and maybe he'd have sustained a longer run on top and gotten some better matches along the way. DiBiase would be an interesting option because at the time, they're kind of winding down on Ted and putting him in the middle of the card. He finishes his main event run after a series with Randy Savage where they didn't draw big houses. They drew respectable houses, and they had good matches but never great matches, so they kind of shifted away from that. They finished the Mega Powers, Mega Bucks angle, and Ted kind of floats into angles to try to elevate other mid-card guys. He does the angle where Hercules is his slave, and they have some matches together. He transitions into a really random, not well-booked feud with Brutus Beefcake that leads to a double count-out at WrestleMania. Take a shot if you're keeping score. It doesn't do anything for either guy. And then eventually they decide to build him back up the next year. I say Haku would have been the ideal choice to work the majority of house show matches on your B shows with Warrior to help train him, help get him ready, and teach him things that he could take advantage of. Have him work with Rude probably once for every 2 times you work Haku, and once with Savage for every 2 times you work Haku in the lead up.
I'm going to give you 4 guys. Give me 50 words, yay or nay, in addition to DiBiase and or Haku. And I'm basing this on participants in the 89 Royal Rumble pay-per-view. First one. And again, the people are like, well, he's already involved in a feud. Okay, we are now doing an alternate universe. Okay. Harley Race. Veteran. A guy on his way out of the company. A guy who could, who had a ton of experience, could really put a shine on the Warrior. Yay or nay?
Okay. So you're not familiar with what Harley has done to the Warrior because they did work together and Harley did not like the Warrior. So what he would do is, especially during battle royals or tag team matches, when the Warrior wasn't suspecting, Harley would tie his tassels to the ropes and then pelt him really hard in the ribs with a left hand. So,
don't you think don't you think like a Pat Patterson or Briscoe could have had a come to Jesus with Harley, like, Harley, I understand what you're saying. Let's talk to the kid. Let's make him understand that this is not boxing. We'll get him to listen to you. Please smarten the kid up. You don't think Harley would have done a favor for the business?
I think Harley would have pulled his shotgun for suggesting such a thing.
Okay. And Harley, scratch. Big John Studd.
Well, John, they wanted to transition into a feud with Andre, so we can talk about that. At the time, no, because John Studd was never a good in-ring performer. I love John Studd as a character, but there really wasn't anything he was going to be able to teach the Warrior. And even at this point in time, John was really not in the best of physical health. That's why his 89 run didn't last. And I don't see what he could contribute in a match with Warrior that would be anywhere near entertaining at this point in time.
I understand he's in a tag team, but again, alternate universe. Arn Anderson.
Arn would have been okay, I think. That could have worked because Arn, obviously a veteran, very good in-ring hand, became a teacher when he accepted agent jobs in both WCW and WWE later on. Clearly knows what he's talking about and doing. And I don't think Arn had such an ego problem where he had a trouble doing a job to anybody. The guy put over a Warrior knockoff named the Renegade years later, so I don't think he'd have had a problem doing the honors for the original, especially with how much he was getting paid at the time, or was supposed to have been getting paid at the time. That's another story. But no, I think Arn would have been a fine fit. Tully not so much because Tully was a dick and would have gone into business for himself. But Arn could have taught the Warrior a couple lessons and had some good matches with him, I think.
My last choice, and this might be reaching a bit because you have to do two different things. You have to do two things in this alternate universe. You have to erase his gimmick from existence, which I would, and this should have never have happened. Probably know where I'm going with this. And you
I
have
think
to turn
so.
him heel.
Can I guess?
You certainly can.
Is it the Red Rooster, Terry Taylor?
It certainly is, Ollie.
Look at that.
Terry?
Yeah. Not a rib, by the way, according to Bruce Pritchard.
Actually, they've explained the Red Rooster thing, and there had to have been somebody in Vince's inner circle that wasn't so dang literal and could tell Vince, no, or either tell Vince or tell the people working with Vince, no, stop being so concrete, you idiots. Just because he says he's the cock of the walk doesn't mean he should be a rooster. Yeah.
Listen, there's I've always maintained that the Red Rooster gimmick was not just a shot at Terry, but it was a shot at Ric Flair, because Terry always carried himself as a wannabe Ric Flair, not in just terms of his attitude of wanting to be the top guy, but in terms of his general look, similarities in the walk and such, and Flair always, having the robe with the feathers and everything like that. It was a joke thing that was a rib on both Terry and Ric Flair. I don't want to hear otherwise. I will never accept it. They ribbed Dusty 2 times, one with the Virgil character having the name Virgil, and the other being when they turned the one-man gang into Akeem, the African Dream. I don't want to hear that there was not a rib on Dusty. It clearly was. Just like the Red Rooster was a rib on Flair. End of story. But here's the thing with Terry, if you work with the Warrior. I think Terry is another guy who would have had such an ego about it that he would have purposefully sandbagged the Warrior at every turn he could and gotten himself fired.
Okay. I'm gonna just say this just because it's my own thing. I would have loved a prolonged card, Bad News Brown, Ultimate Warrior feud, but I think just as you're saying, because personality is a thing, I think at the end of the day, Warrior ends up dead in a trunk working with the Bad News Brown. I don't see that ending well for the Warrior. I think Jim Elwick says one or two things that pisses old Bad News off, and we never see the Warrior again. But I think,
listen, he pissed Rude off being snug with him to the point where Rude just open hand slapped him and knocked him out. Bad News would have gone further than that. Bad News would, and Rude was known as a mean god. Bad News would have grabbed him by his tassels and judo threw him back and forth, remember the Hulk ragdolling Loki in the Avengers? That's what Bad News would have been doing with the Warrior.
For those of you that don't know, Bad News Brown's a bad motherfucker, and some of these guys, I know they're play fighting, wrestling's fake. Yeah, some of these guys will legit hurt you, and Bad News was one of them. I consider myself to be a tough person who will stand my ground even if I take an ass kicking. But yeah, Bad News Brown would have legit backed me off. I'm like, all right, Bad News, cooler head should prevail here. Let's have it come to Jesus before I go to Jesus.
He grew up in poverty in Harlem, New York in the 40s and 50s, okay? Tough area, especially at that time. And then lived in poverty so that he could study judo. Became the first American to medal in judo in the Olympics in 1976, and allegedly was robbed of the chance to go on further in the Olympics in the bronze medal round because they didn't want an American to gold medal, and they wanted it to stay with the Japanese. I've seen the match. It's probably true. And aside from being a legit world-class level judo player, he's just a tough street guy.
Yeah. All right, so we have some ideas. Haku, some amalgamation of Haku / DiBiase with some matches with Savage in the big time and some matches with Rude in the lesser big time. And this is 89, and we are working into 5.
This is January to April 89.
Right, okay. And we're building towards eventually, I think it's Rude versus Warrior at SummerSlam. Okay, so we get to WrestleMania. Who would you have had him take on at WrestleMania? Rude, I'm assuming? You stuck with Rude?
Yeah, I have no issue with that. And him, because you're going to have to get the belt off him and build interest, because he's got to look vulnerable at some point. And why not Rude? Rude is an excellent choice. He's over. The gimmick works. He's been able to draw decent houses, looks like a viable threat to the Warrior, and is able to pull great matches out of him. Rude's the right guy. They made the right call.
All right, so we got to get from Mania now to the rematch with Rude at SummerSlam, which I'm assuming stays. That's fine. They do that, and I think is it then they do the cage, or is it a year later they do the cage?
A year later they do the cage. That's in the redo with Rude. This is the continuation. It's just a standard match at SummerSlam 89.
All right, well, maybe they do the cage a year earlier then, and that's the big blow-up, because, again, I'm really against doing Rude again once he becomes heavyweight champion, but we'll get there in a minute. Get me from Mania to the rematch with Rude at SummerSlam.
There's going to be your return matches on the house show loop, because you got to build interest because people want to see Warrior get the belt back. So having him chase Rude makes sense. At the same time, you got to feed him.
Go ahead. No. That's what I was asking. I was like, we're talking house show loops, and you're not working with just one guy. So who do you supplement? Again, we're still grooming, we're still teaching, we're still smartening. We've already used up some amalgamation of DiBiase and Haku. Who do you transition to subbing in where he doesn't deal with Rude between Mania and SummerSlam?
You're going to take a shot, because one of the things I would do is I would have him work with Curt Hennig. However, because of the gimmick that Curt Hennig has as Mr. Perfect, and you're trying to protect that, you don't want to see him take a loss. Warrior, you're trying to elevate. He's in title contention, and eventually you want him to be the man. You don't want him to take a loss. So you're going to have them do double countouts or disqualifications and such. But there's a legitimate argument that at this point in time, Hennig is the best in-ring performer in the world. He's a veteran. He's been the top guy in the AWA. He's been all over the world. He's really on top of his game athletically, physically, character-wise. I think you can have him work with Warrior. I think you can do handicap matches to really up the threat of having him not just work with Perfect, but Perfect and Lanny Poffo is the genius, who is another guy you can learn a lot from because Lanny's a second-generation guy too. And, you know, being Savage's brother, there's a lot of similarities in how they like to do things. Kurt could teach him, again, we talk about pacing. Kurt could teach him the art of how to make things look even better. They did get to work together eventually, and I thought Hennig did a great job in their matches of making Warrior's offense look incredible, even when Warrior's blown up and can't really muster a good-looking clothesline or shoulder tackle. Hennig's selling and bumping made it look outstanding. And I think that's a match you could include. And even then, by presenting Hennig as a threat to the Warrior, he's perceived as somebody who, oh, wow, this guy is giving the Warrior a hard time. He may be somebody who's going to be up there at the world title level. So I think Kurt and Warrior in a series of countouts or disqualifications or draws, it's not the most satisfying ending, but you're using these to justify the end. It's the means there you get there with.
After SummerSlam, as we said earlier, he moves into an intercontinental title feud with Andre the Giant, and to a degree, an extension of the Heenan family, which culminates in a Survivor Series match with him, Neidhart, and the Rockers versus the Heenan family, which is Andre the Giant, the Brainbusters. Actually, no, Tully's actually not a part of that. So it's just Andre,
no, Tully's
Arn,
fired for cocaine use.
Bobby, and Haku. If you don't do Haku earlier in the year, you do him now. And I think you keep Andre, but I think you actually you rotate in other members of the Heenan family. I think this is where you can also use Arn, especially if they're going to fire Tully.
Arn's gone, though, too. Arn's gone after Survivor Series.
I'm saying, no, between SummerSlam and Survivor Series.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, from SummerSlam to Survivor Series, I think you keep the Warrior in pretty much exclusively in the Heenan family. You have him work those matches with Andre, that's fine. You have him work matches with Arn. You have him work matches with Haku. And I think between all three of those guys, you have plenty of matches and plenty of opportunities for the Warrior to really fine-tune his game. I think you get a lot of good matches out of him, and you actually have then a Survivor Series match that's worth the shit. Because, woo, boy, without doing that, what they've got here looks like a lot of nothing to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was supposed to capitalize on two main feuds. It was supposed to capitalize on the Warrior-Andre feud that was going around the house shows, and they did one angle build up to it right before SummerSlam happened on an episode of Superstars, where Andre ambushed Warrior on behalf of Rude, and started calling himself the Ultimate Giant and wearing face paint of his own. And the Rockers, Brainbusters house show feud and TV feud that had gotten such rave reviews for the match quality. Of course, that fell apart when Tully was, tested positive for cocaine and suspended. And eventually Arn, the last date he works is the Survivor Series show. And they're both supposed to go back to Crockett. Crockett pulls their deal from Tully, partly because of the cocaine, partly because Ric Flair politicked on Arn's behalf to get Arn more money and screw Tully.
All right, so after a successful feud with the Heenan family and specifically Andre, we are moving comfortably into 1990, and now here we have the ramp up, a 4-month ramp up to the WrestleMania and Hulk Hogan. Now here is where you gotta shift into high gear building him up. They don't, but here's what they should have done. As I said earlier, he's got a small mini feud going on with Dino Bravo, and then not a lot happening, and then Hulk Hogan. Keep or throw away the Dino Bravo feud?
So you want to throw away Dino and replace him with somebody else?
No, I'm asking you. Do you keep or do you throw away Dino Bravo?
It's fine. He's somebody who Warrior has to stay on a winning streak at this point. I think the smart build that they did, I think you have to go to the Royal Rumble and look at what they did there. They have everybody, in the ring at one time, including Hulk and Warrior. And Hulk and Warrior wind up clearing the ring. And as soon as they're down, I think it was Jimmy Snuka was the last guy they throw out before it's just Hulk and Warrior. And as soon as it's getting down to those two, you can hear the crowd start losing their shit. And once Snuka goes out and Hulk and Warrior turn to each other, it is unbelievable, the reaction of the crowd in Orlando. Everybody's standing up, and they, do it without making either guy look obviously stronger or weaker than the other, which is smart. They have them do a crisscross and train wreck spot, and then eventually it gets broken up with other guys coming in. But just that tease in the audience alone was enough to justify, yeah, we're going to do this because this is what they want, and this is going to make us some money. So you go from there to them teaming up on Saturday night's main event against Mr. Perfect and the Genius. And there's a little miscommunication spot where Warrior accidentally clotheslines Hogan, thinking he's hitting either Perfect or the Genius. Warrior tries to apologize. They get into a shoving match, and here we go. We're off and running. And, they may not have made Warrior look super strong, but they did little things to really make that match mean more. Maybe the most significant one was they had him be the first guy to beat Mr. Perfect, and he did it at a March 1990 Madison Square Garden house show. He pinned Mr. Perfect cleanly in the middle of the ring, and that was the first time any of us, at least in the New York area, who could pick up that show on the MSG cable network or could be in attendance at the show, that was the first time Mr. Perfect took a pinfall loss to us. And so that's a big deal because you've now ended a 2-year unbeaten streak on the way to going against Hulk, and Hulk never was able to do that to Mr. Perfect. Hulk wound up getting disqualified against Perfect or, counted out, but he never beat Perfect. Warrior did. And so doing these little things to establish that really built that matchup well. I don't really have any complaints as to how they built towards Hogan Warrior, other than maybe they could have done a little bit more on TV with them. But I think for what they did, it worked. And obviously they drew 68,000 people to the Sky Dome to see that match.
Okay. I think my only hiccup with that is, so you keep the Dino Bravo feud, which there's a lot of dark happening here. So it's basically they're building Hogan and Warrior on TV, but off TV they've got him feuding with Dino Bravo, and then that gets them all the way to that culminates on TV with a pinfall victory for the Warrior at the main event in February. Now here's the thing: between the end of February and April 1st, they can't have Hogan and Warrior touch, and they're both faces when that sort of thing mattered. So how do you continue to make Warrior look strong going into his fight with Hogan whilst keeping him away from Hogan, again, continuing to giving him a meaningful feud, small feud, someone for him to chew up? Because what they have on paper here that I'm looking at is a tag team with him and Jake the Snake against Akeem and Ted DiBiase. He squashes some dude named Steve Vega. There's an MSG title defense against Perfect, and then it's WrestleMania. And I feel like that's a grab bag there of a lot of whatever. But why not use that opportunity to chew up maybe a Boss Man or an Akeem in a mini feud? And I say those two because Hogan feuded with both of them. And wouldn't it have been something if maybe Warrior had made a bit of hash out of Boss Man or Akeem when both of those guys gave Hogan fits? I
think Akeem would have been the way to go if you're going to do that. Bossman at the time is obviously transitioning into a babyface role, which booking-wise was obviously the right call based on where he went and, the reactions he got, et cetera, and where he fit in on the card. Akeem really didn't have any other significant moments beyond this point and was soon to leave anyways. In about, I think it's September 1990, he's officially gone. I could be wrong, but we'll go with that. He would have been a good choice. Again, you have a big 6'8", 400-pound guy that wrestled multiple main events for the World Championship against not just Hulk, but Randy Savage too, and very difficult guy for either of them. If you'd have had him, you don't necessarily have to squash Akeem, but if you have Warrior look impressive against him and beat him, with less difficulty than Hulk, then you're getting the idea in people's heads. Well, Hulk had a real hard time with this, and Warrior, he's doing better. The same effect you would have had when you had Warrior going against Andre, and Warrior's beating Andre each time out with less difficulty than Hulk had doing that too. And then you're planting the seed that, I don't know if Hulk is going to be able to beat this guy. I feel like Hulk's had his time. Maybe he's a little bit past it. Maybe this is the Warrior's time.
All right. We talked a lot about WrestleMania already. There's nothing left to be said about that. Now, what we said earlier was the remainder of this year is a lot of horse shit and nothing for the Warrior. So, here's the rules. You've got to give Warrior something to do for the next 6 months or so. Okay? You got to get him from
give me like months.
Yeah, coming out of Mania. So April 1st.
Okay, so like Mania
6.
Mania to Survivor Series, we'll say?
Yeah, Mania to Survivor Series.
Okay.
What do you do? And the rule is you can't do Rude again.
I don't want to do Rude again. And
good.
The main scenario we discussed and would have made the most sense is we talked about how Earthquake stretchered out Hogan, took him off TV. I still to this day don't understand why at that point you've established a brand new monster heel who has not really worked with any of the top guys in any significant way, why he is not immediately the new threat to the new champion.
Exactly.
This is a guy who shelved Hulk Hogan. Never been done before. Warrior has this epic give and take match with Hulk, okay, where, after the match they shake hands, have this great moment of, what's supposed to be a symbolic passing of the torch when Hulk hands him the title. Well, Earthquake just comes and kills him. Children cry. Women cry. Everybody's stunned. How that logically doesn't add up immediately to Warrior versus Earthquake, I'll never understand. Because the mileage you get out of that, not just from having Warrior versus Quake, but you're able to do something to occupy Earthquake until Hogan gets back looking for his own revenge. Okay, people are still going to want to see Hulk come back and get a piece of this guy who took him out. But in the interim, this guy immediately is public enemy number one, so who better to pair him up with than your top guy, your champion, your brand new face of the company? He's already feuded with Quake's running buddy, Dino Bravo. You can have them sneak attack him and try to do the same thing while he's talking about how he's going to avenge Hulk, who was this great champion that, gave him the opportunity and the title shot, and he's going to honor Hulk by being the champ that Hulk was and taking the fight to Earthquake. Man, that writes itself. And you've got something new, something fresh, something where the Warrior is giving away, size advantage like he did to Andre, but he's got a much more mobile, healthy, active, workable opponent than Andre was. Earthquake was a 450-pound man who stood 6'8", that could hit a drop kick to the Warrior's head if he wanted to. Okay? That's the kind of athlete you're dealing with. Great worker. And a guy who could easily not only have a good match with the Warrior because he did it, they had one-off little house show matches here and there that happened way too few and far between. But he's also a guy who, if Warrior stepped out of line the way he did with Rude, John Tenta is going to kill him and make him humble. So I think you could easily go through these steps of Warrior versus Quake, and you can mix in guys here and there to occupy Warrior because he can't exclusively wrestle Earthquake. Have him wrestle Dino on TV on Superstars or Saturday Night's Main Event because that's Quake's running buddy, his tag team partner. You can put Rude in on house shows because, they did the angle with Rude, which was stupid. Why? Because from the time Rude lost the Intercontinental title back to the Warrior at SummerSlam to the time they wrestled each other again, Rude did not have one significant victory on TV or a house show. Not one. Okay? He transitions to a feud with Roddy Piper after Warrior and does the job to Piper in a cage match at Madison Square Garden and a couple other arenas. End of that feud, okay? Not great for Rude. He comes out on the losing end. Then what does he do? He does nothing really of significance other than he's the final three in the Royal Rumble in 1990 with Hogan and Perfect. He wrestles house show matches, doesn't have an angle on TV. Then he asks for time off, and he goes on this crazy awesome workout regime and diet, puts on, like another 20 pounds of muscle, looks great, has a match with Jimmy Snuka, who's basically a jobber at this point in time at WrestleMania, and that's what leads to the Warrior feud. He literally accomplished nothing, beat nobody, and they want to throw him back in the main event after Warrior's already beaten him. Makes no sense. The scenario we throw out with Earthquake makes all the sense in the world. And then after that, you can have mileage with Hogan coming back to get his revenge. Okay, so let's say you do at SummerSlam Warrior versus Earthquake in the cage match. Maybe, you don't have Hogan on that show. You wait for Hogan. You let Warrior see how he can draw on that angle. And I think it draws about the same as the SummerSlam did with the Hogan comeback angle. I really do. Then you can have Hogan come back and do a series of stretcher matches.
I was going to say, if you actually build up Warrior appropriately the way we were talking about, I don't see why it doesn't draw more. I mean, I think people buy into Warrior as the new superhero.
Yeah. And then, then you can transition Earthquake down into a feud with Hogan after that, where they can do like stretcher matches because he stretchered Hogan out. And then they can have their blow off at some point. Now you've got Warrior established. He beat this amazing threat. So what's the next logical step for me after SummerSlam? I think it's Ted DiBiase. Why? Because if you look at the booking of Ted DiBiase through 1989 and 1990, a lot of it was rehab on him to reestablish him as a credible main event threat. He had his runs with Hogan and Savage, did the job, and then they kind of put him back down in the mid-card. But when he's in the mid-card, he's winning. He's beating Hercules. He's drawing with Beefcake, which is essentially a win because it's Hogan's buddy. He's beating your Jimmy Snukas. He's beating Jake Roberts at WrestleMania, which is significant. He's beating the newly face-turned Big Boss Man. And he's also beating Dusty Rhodes. He's beating names, and he's building himself up the card. I had you watch a match today between DiBiase and the Warrior from the main event on the day after Thanksgiving, 1990. I would venture to say that you probably thought that's one of the better Warrior matches you've ever seen.
Sure.
Now, we have it established. Go ahead.
What I'm looking at here is they have a main event taping October 30th, 1990, that ends in a DQ finish against.
Yeah, that's the one.
Assuming that, even if they keep that, if you go ahead and make the Ultimate Warrior versus DiBiase and then with a clean finish, the main event of Survivor Series, instead of what they actually did with the Warrior, and then you back it up with what they did with Hogan and his group versus Earthquake and the rest of the Hart family, that's fine. You have the Hogan Earthquake blow off, and you have a proper main event for Survivor Series with your actual champion and an actual threat that as you were pointing out, were already building up. Putting the Ultimate Warrior with the Road Warriors and having him feud with Demolition did nothing for nobody.
No, and they drew really poor houses all over the country. Like, if you look at those numbers, they did a show in September in Madison Square Garden. The capacity in Madison Square Garden is roughly 20,000 seats, okay? Now, business is down at this period anyway, so you're taking like a 12,000 13,000 tickets sold house as a good house. They sold less than 6,000 tickets. They did that same match in smaller arenas in places like the Rosemont Horizon in Chicago. They did like 2,500 tickets there. Those matches weren't drawing anything anywhere. Now, instead of that, if you have the Warrior and DiBiase, who has, again, been rehabbed through the past 2 years to really become a main event guy once again, even though he never gets that shot really, you have proof on video. There's a couple of matches that they had. There's really two. There's the main event match that I had you watch today that was a really good match. They had a similar match in Japan at a co-promoted card with Genichiro Tenryu's group. It's similar. It's also a very good match. It was released on one of the World Tour VHSs in the early 90s. But you have proof that DiBiase, incredible in-ring performer, can have really good 13, 14-minute matches with the Warrior. He is somebody who the Warrior has not had an extended program with, who people accept as a credible opponent, and is a guy who's drawn money in the past. No pun intended, since he's the $1 Million Man. He's beaten a significant number of babyfaces over the past 2 years. Why not go with him in something fresh? You can have them in the first one-off Survivor Series match or do a team match, whatever. And instead, where's the Warrior on the Survivor Series card?
Right, he's in the undercard. Well, let us address one thing we said earlier. We used the $1 Million Man earlier in the run-up to...
You used him. I didn't want to use him.
Well, we were alternating him with Haku. These were ideas. But I was going to say, well, I don't want to reuse Rude, especially because of how they used him after the whole IC feud in the first place. You're making a point with DiBiase, which is put enough time in between them, and you make DiBiase, and you rebuild DiBiase into a threat, and then you give them an interesting story. I'm okay in this instance with doing a redo, especially because DiBiase has this long history. I mean, look, if you're a kid watching the program at that time, you know DiBiase is a main event guy. You know that anytime if they give him enough wins in the interim, that if they put him back in the world title picture, you buy him as a legitimate threat. So this is fine, especially if they give they put some fresh, interesting plot points in the story that they tell getting to the match. So if you're out there keeping score and you're like, well, I thought you said no redos. Given these elements, it's okay to do a redo in this circumstance with Ted DiBiase specifically.
And again, you're looking at the time frame. If you start this after SummerSlam, right? I think there was an actual Saturday Night's Main Event that aired October 1990 that was taped in September. Instead of doing their match that they did a month after that, do it on that Saturday Night's Main Event. Have it end in some kind of DQ schmoz where you don't get a clear winner and build interest and really make DiBiase look like he could have potentially beaten the Warrior. Then you can put them on your major house show circuits. You don't have them main event, Grand Forks, North Dakota. You have them main event Madison Square Garden, the LA Sports Arena, those arenas you do. Have them work there. Then you can have DiBiase feast on an upper mid-card babyface that maybe he hasn't gotten to yet or has but did good business with, like a Dusty, a Jake Roberts, those type of guys, to keep his heat up for Warrior. And then you have Warrior, take on your underneath guys at that point that are heels. Have him face a Warlord. Imagine, the potential of that poster in a high school somewhere. Oh, man, look at those guys. Let's go pay to see this. I'm always kind of surprised Warlord as a single never really got more main events on the house show loop because of his look. But that's another story. And have him work those guys, and then your big arenas, DiBiase Warrior. And then at Survivor Series, you do the first ever singles match at a Survivor Series, and you do it for the championship. You do Warrior versus DiBiase instead of having Warrior open the show. Yeah. With the Legion of Doom and Kerry Von Erich against Mr. Perfect and the three members of Demolition.
Because nothing says your champion matters not at all like opening a show. I know it's a little bit more common now, especially with the 97 different world title belts they've got. But back in the day, if your title closed the show, except when it didn't, and then you signal to the audience that the guy holding the belt doesn't matter. And that's a big part of why his whole run doesn't even work. It's because they didn't treat him like a champion. That's what we've been saying for the past hour. They did not treat the Warrior like a champion. They treated him like he was just some dude.
When your first shot to headline a pay-per-view after you've won the championship turns into a co-main event because they're bringing Hulk back, it's not a ringing endorsement of their faith in you. And it's really not giving you an opportunity to prove your merit. Now, you can say whatever you want to say about the Warrior as an in-ring performer, needing to be carried by a certain level of performer. You could say that he wasn't drawing a ton of money in certain aspects. But that's all fine. I'll point to again that at this point in time, nobody was drawing a ton of money for them. Nobody. I'll point to the fact that they made a poor booking error in rehashing a feud that was all done with without any kind of circumstance that made you want to see more of it, or build Rude up as a credible threat other than saying, well, he beat the Warrior for a title before. It's a bunch of bad missteps that severely limit the potential of a guy. And you can say what you want to say about the Warrior's attitude, about his lack of ability. We've seen guys who have poor attitudes and a lack of ability become megastars. Goldberg comes to mind immediately.
I was going to say Brock Lesnar.
Brock could go, but Brock had a crappy attitude and became a megastar.
And so, look, Brock's attitude hasn't changed. Brock's attitude is still shit. But A, Brock can go. B, Brock's an attraction. Let's go ahead and shift now, because here's where we come to it. This is the make or break year. This is where we really get to do a lot of alternate universe fantasy stuff here, and where we build towards the final endpoint, which is actually Hogan versus Flair. Because I'm gonna put two tracks that we can go on, and I'll let Pat decide how we're gonna do this. The first
no
track,
pressure there.
The first track is that the main event the main event of WrestleMania 7 is a co-main event. We have two matches. We have one for the title that it's going to end the show, but then we also have the feel-good main event for WrestleMania 7. They would do this a year later, by the way, with WrestleMania 8, so it's not like it's untoward. Now, Bruce Pritchard says the goal was always to go with Hogan and Sarge, the America versus the Iraqi sympathizer. And I don't want to go too far into the realm of fantasy by saying let's not even do that idea. I'm fine with it. But there are two ways you can go here. You can keep the belt on the Warrior or drop it to Sarge and have him win it back at WrestleMania. And just let it be that, kind of a Lex Luger thing where they transition Warrior away from the, amazing Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Warrior into I'm the American Warrior, and they don't have to call him that. But he is the Ultimate Warrior, a real American hero, fighting for the honor of the country against turncoat and Iraqi sympathizer Sergeant Slaughter. And that's your feud going into WrestleMania. And then you've got to figure out what you're going to do for the first part of the year, first quarter. And then you have to also figure out what you're going to do with Hulk. So track A is WrestleMania is Sarge versus Warrior, same concept, America versus Iraq. Track B, co-main event, no belt, the American hero, Hulk Hogan, Iraqi sympathizer Sarge, title versus career, Savage versus the Ultimate Warrior. Which way do you want to go? Which makes
here's
more money,
my initial,
which is more successful.
And here's my initial plan. It's going to end up going on track B, because here's what I would have done. You have Warrior beat DiBiase in their big blow-off at Survivor Series. Not unlike real life, you have somebody constantly calling out Warrior, demanding a title shot. That guy is Randy Savage. So rather than go with Sarge versus Warrior at the Royal Rumble, I go with Savage getting that shot at the Royal Rumble. Basically by doing enough things to irk Warrior and piss him off that the Warrior finally has had enough and he wants his shot at Savage. And what you do is Savage and Warrior at the Royal Rumble. As far as Slaughter, you can still build him up. And what I would probably have him do to really build him up for a match with Hogan that's a showcase match, has a good story behind it with Sarge being the Iraqi, and Hulk, who still needs something to do without putting him in the title picture, being what Hulk was best, the American good guy. So at the Royal Rumble, I book a match between Jim Duggan, who's getting real pissed off at Sarge doing all this stuff, and I have Sarge do a horrendous stretcher job on Duggan. And that basically, and he's going to get to the point where he's going to do something to the flag after the match. You have people jumping the rail trying to get at him, but it's Hulk who comes down and saves the flag and is crying over his friend Jim Duggan because Slaughter did something to him, hit him with a fireball, whatever. He badmouthed America. He's had it. Hulk's had it. So then after that, you have the 30-man Royal Rumble where Hulk just tears through it like a savage, tosses guys left and right, yelling Slaughter the whole time, gets to the win, and he sees, somebody in the crowd with an American flag, and he goes out and he retrieves the flag and he waves it and he says, Slaughter, makes a call out, you don't come at my country, these colors don't run, all that stuff. And then he makes the big pledge that he's going to rid the WWF of Sergeant Slaughter and this Iraqi threat. In the main event of the Royal Rumble, you have Warrior and Savage. Savage cheats and goes over and takes the title from the Warrior. Savage, in the months leading to WrestleMania, goes through every loophole he can to avoid giving the Warrior a rematch. Till finally, Warrior says he'll do anything to get a shot at Savage. Savage says, would you put your career on the line? And Warrior agrees. And Savage says, and Warrior, in his caveat says, but you can't run from me anymore. We're doing this in a steel cage.
Now, I got to point out to you, as Bruce Pritchard had pointed out on the podcast, part of the reason they did the career match was Savage wanted to go out and use the opportunity to take time off. So you got to factor in. Well, we're going
to get to that.
Okay.
We're going to get to that. We don't end up having that great moment with Elizabeth and Randy. I'm going to say that straight off the bat. What it is Warrior basically gives a real beating to Savage towards the end of the match, to the point where they just take Randy off TV for a while. But Warrior reclaims the belt in a really epic, awesome cage match that sees Randy hit the elbow from the top of the cage and Warrior still kick out. Instead of doing your 5 elbow drops from the top, he does just one, but off the top of the cage, which hasn't been seen since, Jimmy Snuka jumped off the top of the cage 8 years earlier. And I think that's an epic moment. And I think you have the Warrior just kick out of it, go really hog wild on Savage, throw him all around the cage. Savage is freaked out because he hit his coup de grace and doesn't know what it's going to take to keep this guy down. Warrior just unleashes an epic beatdown. Savage blades. Warrior climbs to the top of the cage and poses with the crowd and just, points up to his, Warrior gods and just descends down the cage as Savage just lies a bloody mess in the middle of the cage. And you have Hogan triumphantly before that, beat up Slaughter, put the good old American spin on things in a Desert Storm match like they did on the house show circuit. And Hogan beats him by hitting him with the leg drop, putting the American flag over Slaughter and pinning him, where it's like a sheet you'd find over a body in an autopsy room. and then he picks it up and waves it proud, and there's soldiers in the front row that are on leave. He goes and celebrates with them, and you're off and running after that.
Okay. I'm going to tell you exactly what I want to see, what we got to get to. The end point, because I like what they did. I like how they did it, and I think it's actually a good setup for WrestleMania 8. So we now have to get from Mania, where Hogan goes over Sarge, and the Warrior goes over Savage, and Savage is stretchered off TV after an epic cage match. I like it, but here's where we got to get to. We got to get to the Royal Rumble, where the title has been vacated, and Ric Flair wins the vacated title, and we have the march towards Hogan at WrestleMania 8. And at WrestleMania 8, we need something for the Warrior to do at that time. So there's a lot of space to fill between now and then.
So now we're saying if we're getting there, we're saying that the scenario where Warrior is owed money and holds Vince up for it, and we get that never happens.
Yes, we're going to be adults in this universe, and McMahon is actually going to pay the man what he's owed. That never happens. Because here's the thing, the Warrior's career is ultimately marred by Vince McMahon, and unless someone's got details that say otherwise, misbehaving in a way that defies logic and maturity.
Well, do you want the actual facts of it?
Go ahead. Give it to me in 50 words or less.
Oh, I can't do that. I have the faxes right in front of me, though.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, there's 5 points that basically the Warrior makes to Vince in a fax that he sends after WrestleMania 7. And, he's basically making these things, the Warrior. He wants a $550,000 release of the monies allotted to him to purchase his home, because he'll take that as a WrestleMania 7 payoff, even though he feels he should get more because Hulk got more, and he feels his match meant as much to that show as Hogan's did. In his words, he says, "But let it be noted that it is not fair that I take that as a payout. I meant as much or more to that show as Hulk. I deserve to be paid the same. I know what Hulk got." 2, 4 days off every other time period except for pay-per-views. 3, I want the same pay cut as Hulk gets on all pay-per-views, main events, Friday specials, house shows, and proof as such. The same pay cut applies to what Hulk has been paid with relationship to past events, WrestleMania 5, 6, and 7, i.e. when Hulk was top draw. 4, I want numbers and proof of monies done on 1-900 Hulk, and likewise same pay cut for my hotline. 5, same pay cut on all forms of merchandising. That's from Warrior to Vince. Vince responds. Do you have any major objections to?
Hang on. Do you have any major objections to that? Because it sounds like he's saying, "I'm the top guy. This is what you paid the other top guy. You should pay me this. You should pay me the same, if not more. I'll just take the same." That doesn't sound unreasonable to me.
No, it doesn't. I think you have to look at what those aggregate shows drew in response to what Hulk was drawing, to be fair. But he doesn't sound like he's objecting to that. I think he just wants the percentage cuts of what's there, not what could have been there. You know what I mean? And he's even saying he's going to take less of a payoff for WrestleMania so he can buy his house that he wants to buy.
Right. If he's saying, if Hulk got, I'm just going to throw numbers out just for the sake of argument. If Hulk gets 50% of a draw, then I should get 50% of a draw. And I'm not saying that I should get exact numbers. I'm saying I should get the same percentage. And if I draw less, fine, but I get 50% of less, not just flat less. That's not unreasonable.
No. So here's Vince's reply. That fax from the Warrior was sent on July 10th, 1991. I don't have the immediate date of this in front of me, but whatever. This is Vince's reply. I think it's 3 days later, it looks like. You'll be paid an aggregate amount of $550,000 for your participation in WrestleMania 7. With the exception of special events only, you will receive 4 days off every other time period off. Now, Warrior requested it for pay-per-views. Vince is saying special events, whatever that will translate to. 3, your pay rate on house shows will increase to 4 to 5% of the net, effective immediately, with the understanding that no other WWF athlete will be paid at a higher rate. Likewise, no one will get a higher rate than you on pay-per-view events. I question the validity of that because we don't know what the percentage that he got at the time was, and we don't know what it is comparatively to what Hulk was getting. The number I've heard that Hulk got as far as house show numbers was 13% of the gate. That could be hearsay, but I've heard it from multiple sources that Hulk got 13% of the gate. And that's the gross gate, not the net gate. So he's undercutting Warrior off the bat, which is understandable because he's a businessman and he's losing money at the time. He's not drawing what he was. Okay. So let's say he was giving Warrior 5% of the house. Now he's giving Warrior 10% of the house. Okay. 4, effective immediately, your royalty rate on all forms of merchandise is to be increased. That specific amount will be determined in writing within 1 week. 5, your compensation for the Warrior 900 hotline will be identical to that of the Hulk 900 Light hotline, and you'll receive documentation for this within 1 week. I regret the turmoil you've put yourself through, and you're agonizing over what you feel is fair compensation. And even though we have a difference of opinion over some of these matters, I am resolved to work with you in the same honest and equitable way that I always have. Furthermore, I would like to express to you my deepest appreciation and admiration for you as a performer and as a member of the WWF family, as a man, and as my friend, Vince. Here's the problem. That's July 13th, 1991 that Vince sent this fax. August 26th of 1991, which is over a month later, Warrior had apparently received almost none of anything besides his WrestleMania payoff. So now, Warrior did main event house shows around the loop. He was notably working with The Undertaker in body bag matches. At this time, he was working the 900 hotline where he recorded stuff for, the same way they had the 1-900 Hulk. They had the Warrior hotline, which apparently he didn't receive any money for. I can't imagine that nobody called the hotline. It probably wasn't a huge seller, but I would imagine somebody did. To me, the big one is the royalty rate on merchandise, because well after Warrior was gone from the WWF at this point in time, Warrior merchandise was still all over Toys R Us. A lot of your local toy stores still had, Warrior toys and hats and such. And even after Warrior was fired from SummerSlam 91, the following year before he came back, they marketed an Ultimate Warrior costume where you had a strap-on Warrior mask that looked like his paint, shoelaces that were neon colored that you could substitute for tassels, wristbands, and a shirt that had the Warrior's physique on it. How do I know this? Because I had this. So, not for nothing, but you're talking about a pretty significant amount of money over that month. Let's say Warrior was on the road for 3 weeks at that time and didn't get any cut of it. That's a lot of money that's not in his pocket that probably should be at that point in time.
All right, so I'm going to go back and say, I'm going to go back and say this. I'm not sure what other detail there is that you wanted to, and I'm certainly open to hearing it. But I think to cut to the quick, I'm going to say exactly what I said before. In this universe, everyone's an adult. Everyone honors their contracts, and everyone gets paid what they're owed. And there isn't this. First of all, it doesn't even get to this point, because for him to have written that fax meant this was coming. And again, this is the mental health person in me, but you don't just wake up one day and go, "Oh, you fucking people owe me money." That comes from a place. Okay?
No, you're talking. He worked WrestleMania. I believe it was March 31st of 91. This is a fax he sent July 10th of 91. So this is building.
Right. So look. I think instead of acting like a carny ripoff artist, you have people in place, if not him exactly, to deal with this sort of thing well before it reaches to the it reaches to the point where it's going to explode, and he has to send a fax. There should have been people dealing, or a person dealing with Warrior and saying, hey, how's your money situation? What's going on? And the thing of it is that if they had, and if you're wondering, like, wow, you guys are talking a lot of the money and not a lot of booking, what happened to that conversation? This all ties together, because the whole point that we were making earlier about his run post winning the title, post Mania 6, is that the company never got behind him. It was always about Hulk, even in absentia. And so if they're serious about anointing him and they get behind him, then the money gets behind him too. And the people running the company get behind him in a way that they got behind Hulk, in the sense that they're making sure he's taken care of. And I'm not saying they gave him the earth, the moon, and the stars and half the company. I'm saying they don't treat the guy like a fucking stepchild. It never gets to that point. And so he's not fucking up at night, paranoid that, he's not really the guy and it's always Hulk, because that never happens either. And at some point, if Hulk is whispering in the ear like, Rasputin in Vince McMahon's ear, someone has to tell Hulk to go fuck himself, okay? We agreed he was the guy and you wanted time off. Enough already. You've had a zillion years on top. Take a break. What pisses me off about this era of the WWE is that nobody stands between Vince and the talent and says, everyone needs to stop behaving like a bunch of children and animals, and let's all be professional here.
Well, and part of the same thing too is the crowds themselves have a lot of the same attitude. Okay, you're getting to a point like where the house shows start to dip in late '89 into early 1990, even with Hulk on top, because people are, they've been with Hulk for 6 years now. Eventually, people are going to want something different, unless you're fucking Bruno and nobody ever gets tired of you, okay? You're going to have a pushback. And what happened was they started replacing Hulk on the house shows, even when he was still the top guy and still the champ. They started replacing Hulk on house shows here and there. And maybe they would do a good first house show without him, and then the numbers would drop dramatically, because it's like taking away a toy from a child, where maybe this was the kid's favorite toy from ages 4 to 7, and then they didn't really play with it as much anymore. And then you tell them, oh, we're going to go ahead and give this toy to your little brother. And no, that's mine. I have so many cherished memories with this. It's not going away. I'm going to start playing with it again immediately. That was kind of the public reaction to changing the guard a little bit from Hulk to Warrior. And again, not necessarily Warrior's fault so much as they didn't try to gently transition Hulk out of the picture. They basically went full bore into Hogan versus Warrior. He's going to replace him. This is how we're doing it.
And then they don't.
So maybe there could have been a little bit, and then they half-ass it, and they're still kind of teasing you with, well, Hulk's still going to be here. Hulk's still going to be the guy, but he's not the guy. There's this guy, and Hulk's going to be your 1A guy, though. It's going to be okay.
Yeah,
which is kind of the same thing they did to. Oh, I was going to say it's kind of the same thing they did to Savage.
Yeah, you break up with your girlfriend, but we're still friends. Nope, it doesn't work. So, all right. So I think we're establishing that in this universe, everyone's an adult and acts like a professional. Everyone, the Warrior doesn't go insane. Vince isn't an asshole. Everyone gets paid what they deserve, and we're going back to the business of making money. We are at the point now where, again, Warrior has beaten Savage in a cage. Hulk has beaten Sarge. There's still money to be made going into SummerSlam, maybe or not. Let's talk about it. But we have to get to, and again, I'm going to give you one detail. Something happens at Survivor Series that causes the title to be vacated, whoever has it at the time, and the title is then won by Ric Flair in the Royal Rumble. Go.
Okay, and we have to get to Hogan Flair at WrestleMania. That's the goal, right?
That is the goal, yes.
Okay. Well, I would do something that they probably really could have cashed out big on that they could have used at the time. And I'm going to build to SummerSlam being the rematch Hulk versus Warrior.
Okay, so you're done with Sarge as the Iraqi sympathizer after Mania.
Yeah, I think that angle has played its course. I mean, I know that SummerSlam was a sellout because you had Hulk and Warrior teaming up against Sarge and Adnan and Mustafa, but they also had stuff to draw people to that besides that event. So I'm over Sarge at this point. I'm going to take Sarge off TV. He can do his vignettes, I want my country back and whatever. But I'm done with that character and that angle. I think the world is done with that angle at that point in time.
So from Mania to SummerSlam, we build towards Hogan Warrior 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't necessarily need to turn either guy heel at that point. I think it's an interesting thing to toy with the notion of it. I'm willing to bet that even though I probably drew good at WrestleMania, I still didn't, super overshoot my bounds and, do WrestleMania 3 numbers. I think there is pushback that people do want Hulk back. Even though we didn't half-ass it like the WWE did, we supported Warrior. We tried to build him as much as we could. I think we put him in captivating angles, even taking the belt off him to have him win it back in this big redemption match with Savage. I think there's still the call of the loyalists of Hogan who want a shot at it. And, the old saying is the money's in the rematch. Now, they did SummerSlam at Madison Square Garden. They sold it out that year with that, okay? I think you do even more business with this where you open up the Felt Forum in Madison Square Garden and have people watching on the video screen. That's another about 15,000 seats in that arena you could sell. I think the pay-per-view numbers get bumped up even higher. You could still do the Savage.
Instead of doing Madison Square Garden, why not do Giant Stadium?
I think that's too ambitious for the time when your house show business was going on a downward spiral no matter what. Because you got to remember, too, you have to look at a time period, too. And there was an economic drop-off, too.
Yeah, but, I mean, again, they do a good crowd in a stadium for 6. You don't think the rematch, even as an arboration, I hear what you're saying, but as an arboration, and I'm thinking big here, if you're promising from April to August a straight build towards the rematch between your two biggest guys in the company, you don't think they sell out Giant Stadium?
I think the pessimist in me says no, but okay, we'll go with it. Okay, we'll book it for the Meadowlands. Okay, East Rutherford, New Jersey. We're gonna try to sell that out, and I think a lot of the undercard stays the same to support it. I still go with Perfect Brett, for example. I still go with the Legion of Doom going for the tag titles. I think that makes sense. But my build is ultimately towards Hogan Warrior 2. And how do we get there? Okay. Well, there's some new faces that emerge and things that happen. You're going to have Jake Roberts go heel during this point in time. And I know the conventional wisdom says that the easiest way to do it would be having Warrior turn heel as champion and address the crowd saying, I've given you everything, but you still want him. And you point to Hulk. I think that's one way to go, but I think it's short-sighted. I think you burn a lot of your fan support for Warrior, which is probably even bigger how we've booked it as opposed to how they booked it in real life. And Warrior still had a ton of fan support. So I think it's short-sighted to do that. I think you kill a lot of potential future marketability with the Warrior, and I don't want to do that. I want to make as much money as I can over as long a period as I can without having to do a quick cash out.
I was going to say, why don't you tag him? I mean, keep Sergeant Adnan around a little longer, and let's do a couple of main events with Warrior and Hogan. Go ahead. Here's
the thing. There's two real big heels that are emerging at this time that have come into the company. One is The Undertaker. One is Sid. I think you can immediately bring those guys. Well, not so much immediately with The Undertaker because he's been around a couple months, but hasn't been in a significant feud yet. In the summer of '91, he would get that opportunity when he feuded with the Warrior in these body bag matches. When they did the angle when he locked the Warrior in the casket on TV. And then eventually that led to him doing those and working with Hogan, et cetera, et cetera. Sid, they made the mistake of bringing in as a babyface. They were going to make him your next Hogan. Sid is a heel. Sid looks like a heel. Sid performs like a heel. Sid carries himself like a heel.
Mm-hmm.
That guy is made to be a heel. I think you do an angle where each of them gets paired off with one. And you're running the A-Loop house show circuit with, say, Warrior versus Taker. Because you can do a lot of gimmickry with their characters to kind of support the lack of good wrestling in those matches. You can do casket matches and the like through that.
Right.
Hogan and Sid are better at this point in time together, and I think you do have Sid cutting promos about, for years I had to hear about the great Hogan, and look at you. You don't have a belt. You don't have anything. You're nothing. I'm here to take you out. And you have Hogan and Sid working together. Well, this builds towards a Saturday night's main event where Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior take on Sid and The Undertaker. During this, you have somebody sitting at ringside with Bobby Heenan, and that's Ric Flair. And Flair's sitting in the audience holding his big gold WCW belt. And he's, jeering at, Hogan and Warrior and all this stuff. And Warrior will turn around and be distracted by him. And Hulk's looking for a tag, and Warrior turns around. He's not there. You have this scenario play out, and the two of them get heated over it. And eventually it winds up costing them the match because they're both so preoccupied with not paying attention to each other and paying attention to Ric Flair. Particularly Warrior getting distracted because he's a simpleton. So this leads to, Hulk eating a chokeslam and a tombstone from Sid and Taker and getting pinned. And Flair laughs it up at ringside with Heenan, and you go from there, and you've got this heat now between Warrior and Hogan. And this plays out over interviews each guy does on Superstars and Wrestling Challenge, and eventually it comes to a point where Hulk says, I've never asked you for anything. We've been friends. But the one thing I never asked you for that I could have was a rematch. And then the crowd goes, oh, we're going to see it again. And he goes, you were better than me one night. I was better than everybody for 6 years. Can you say that? And then you get into the booking of Hulk versus Warrior. And this time, Hulk goes over. Clean as a sheet. What this leads to is going to be your Survivor Series match. And this time I say we're going to go with Hogan versus Sid. Because we'll say Sid got the pinfall in the tag match. And he's using that as leverage to say, I should be the guy to get the shot at Hogan.
Now, what's Warrior doing between now and Survivor Series?
Warrior is dealing with the newly heel turned Jake Roberts. Because that's the angle they wanted to do that never got off the ground with Warrior being fired. I say this time you could play it out. Whereas Warrior's having a match with, let's say The Undertaker, and Jake comes and interferes. And you kind of have the same build-up almost as they did, but you have a little bit of a fresher take on it. So you have Warrior working against Jake at the time. And they'll have Survivor Series teams where Warrior has,
Maybe this time the Warrior doesn't beat up snakes.
Yeah, he won't kick snakes all over the floor of a dark, room and have PETA wanting to kill him. So, you have Warrior captain a Survivor Series team with a mystery partner against, we'll say it's Jake, The Undertaker, and, two random heels of the time who could be put into that team. IRS and DiBiase. How about that?
Sure.
And then you have Warrior have a team of the Legion of Doom as his backup and a mystery partner. And that mystery partner is Randy Savage, who's ready to come back. You have Warrior do a promo the week before about how he's, the guy he's tested his mettle and battled him to the very end, and he knows the Warrior spirit that lies within this man. And you have Savage come and he says, the Warrior put me to my very limits. He made me question everything and, evaluate where I stood as a man. And I know that I gave my best and it just wasn't enough, but I'm here and I'm back and I'm better than ever, all that stuff. And that's where you go with that. Survivor Series, you have Flair have a match early in the card like he did in real life, where it's, Flair has a team against Piper's team, and you shift the lineups a little bit. Flair is sole survivor of that match. Same thing. You could do the same scenario where Flair interferes on behalf of Sid to cost Hogan the title, and you do a deal where, say, Jack Tunney, same thing. He's involved in this is not going to stand. I'm ordering a rematch with, Ric Flair barred from ringside.
And we go to this Tuesday in Texas.
You know what the thing is, though? I wouldn't even do that pay-per-view.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Here's what I'm going to say. I think we have to keep it because what we're changing is some of the backstage attitude and unprofessionalism. I'm not changing the search for more money. And they were testing whether or not a Tuesday pay-per-view was a good idea. So I think what you put on it is debatable, but I think you have to keep it in there.
Okay.
Because
so we'll
that
do,
exists.
I'll do, then I'll do a 3-match card on it. I'll do, and maybe I'll make some money on it because I'll do Hogan versus Sid, the rematch. Flair's banned from ringside. I'll do Warrior versus Jake. And I'll do Savage versus Flair. And I'll have Flair go over Savage. I'll have Warrior and Jake and then some kind of whatever to keep them going. And in the main event, I'll have interference from Flair, Jake, Undertaker, all these guys coming in and making run-ins, crazy amount of run-ins, to the point where Tunney says, and eventually Hogan gets a crazy fall somehow. Botched interference from one of the guys trying to hurt him, whatever. Tunney says, this is ridiculous. If all these men want a shot at the title, they're going to get it because I'm holding the title vacant and it'll be decided in the Royal Rumble.
Perfect.
Nobody can cry. Nobody can complain. Everybody has the same chance as everybody else to win it.
All right, we go to the Royal Rumble. Go ahead.
You're off and running at the Rumble, and that's when you put the title on Flair. And, maybe now do we still say the NWA or WCW sues so that you can't show the belt on TV?
I think it's immaterial, but yes.
Okay, so they can't do that. Well, what I would do is I would protect Flair through this period of time where that he never takes a loss by pinfall or submission on TV. And then when he wins the Royal Rumble, he can say, for the first time in history, I held my belt, the Real World Championship, and now I've taken the WWF Championship. There is no disputing I am the greatest wrestler on the planet. I am the only World Heavyweight Champion. I am the greatest wrestler there's ever been. Nobody's done this and nobody ever will because I'm never losing. Woo. Okay,
all right.
Well, now how do you decide who gets the shot at Flair?
Right.
Because there's not a pay-per-view in between. You're going to have 2 Saturday night main event shows. And everything else is house shows and superstars build up. What I would end up doing is ultimately you want Hogan and Flair in your main event. The other 2 angles you've been cultivating underneath have been Undertaker, Sid, Savage, Warrior. And then you have other guys you can mix in like Jake Roberts and Roddy Piper and Bret Hart, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Let me quick jump in here and say, now, as legend has it, you can fill in the details if I screw this up at all, but as legend has it, the reason they aborted Hogan Flair was they tried it on the house show circuit. It was the shits. And we're going to talk about this on another podcast the next time we do this, which is why the Flair WWE or WWF run didn't go so good. And I'm going to talk a lot about Flair's fucking mentality as a wrestler. But to get to the point, Hogan and Flair off camera was the shits, and they got cold feet, and they went in another direction. In this world, if I have to kidnap the both of them, lock them in Stu Hart's dungeon and say, you can't come out until you can produce a professional wrestling match that's actually entertaining, then that's what we do. I don't know what it takes to get these two idiots to click. Knowing what they're going to do years later at Bash at the Beach, there's no way if I'm working for the WWE, I get cold feet. I force the issue. I make them work with Pat Patterson. I'm joking about the dungeon thing, but there's something that has to be done so that this match is appropriate for WrestleMania, because nothing stops that from happening. So for those of you out there like, oh, man, why are you insisting? Because there's money there. It's the match everyone wanted to see. And I understand that when they saw it, they went, maybe it should have been left in our imagination and not in real life. But that's the thing. Instead of being chicken shit and getting cold feet and running in another direction that ultimately was the shits anyway, and let's face it, WrestleMania was the shits, you fix the problem. You have all these great talents with years of experience. And just like we said about the Warrior, if there's a problem, figure out what the problem is and then fix it. And if you've got an idea of how you fix Hogan and Flair so that it's passable or even good, now's a good time. But I wanted to make sure people understood that. I'm acknowledging there's an issue. The fix in my universe is we don't act like an asshole. We fix the problem.
The main thing with the Hogan Flair matches is that they weren't necessarily bad. They happened at a time when Hogan was at his low point as a draw. They happened at a time, when this had been the match of the 80s. This was the match that nobody ever thought they were going to see, because one guy was the antithesis of the other, working for the opposite companies. And it's almost like a scenario like with Pacquiao and Mayweather, or Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard. It was something that happened after when it should have, but it still had a lot of value to it. For whatever reason, each guy is what you would call a routine worker, which means that they have a set routine of things they like to do based on a certain opponent type. So for Flair, the most similar guy that he'd worked with to this point to Hogan would probably be Lex Luger, a big, muscular, powerful babyface who could throw him around and do power man spots. Hogan had wrestled smaller technical guys to this point, like DiBiase, Hennig, and that brand, and that would have been the closest to a Flair. Guys who take very hard bumps and try to make Hulk look very good. For whatever reason, neither guy wanted to break from their routine. Problem is, it didn't look good when each guy tried to get their stuff in their routine with the other. My take on the two is going to be very much based on personal preference, where I think Hulk worked a style that could work with anybody and could mix it up and not have different things. Flair had his one match that he had to work and couldn't do anything else at this point in time. And I think it didn't get over with the audience. I think I think part of it is because, at least with Hulk's routine, there was a story to it. There was a psychology to it. With Flair, I never saw a real story or a psychology to what he was doing. I just saw a guy doing random stuff out of nowhere that never made any sense to me and looked goofy. And I think that was the backlash from a lot of the audience that saw the matches. Initially you're supposed to have a match, and the rematch is supposed to outdraw the first meeting of a big match. Right. Well, so I'm going to pull up some numbers.
Hang on. I think what I'm hearing is these two needed supervision. These two really did need to work closely with Pat. And Pat needed to be like, I understand you two have been doing this for a zillion years, and but it's the shits, and we need to fix it. And so I'm going to agent this thing from soup to nuts, and we're going to produce something that's that's real, entertaining for the WWF audience at that time.
Well, and I think too, part of it is because of the egos of the two guys involved. where Hulk had always been the man in the WWF. In the NWA, Flair was always the man. He called the shots. And I think it was both of them unwilling to budge in that Flair thought he had more than earned his stripes and he was coming in to be a top guy, and so he should have top guy respect. Probably felt like, well, now this guy's in my house, so I'm the one calling the shots. It's my way.
Good.
I don't think either guy.
I tell them both, look, I want Hogan versus Flair at WrestleMania 8, but so help me God, I'll do the Warrior versus Bret Hart if I have to.
I tell them it's Haku's way if they don't shape up.
I'm good with that too.
But just to put it in perspective, okay, like we're talking about rematches, okay? Hogan and Flair wrestled November 30th, 1991, Madison Square Garden. They drew a 15,000 seat house, which is extremely good for that point in time. It's not a sellout, but it's the biggest house they've had in a while because it's the dream match come true in New York City. They come back with it the following month. Do you want to take a guess how many they drew?
No, go ahead.
Literally 1 month later, December 29th. They go from 15,000 to 11,000. You're talking a 30% dip in attendance. That is insanely bad.
Right.
And that's why that match didn't happen at WrestleMania 8, among other reasons. But to me, if there's one thing that sticks out, when you not only can't maintain the audience you had, but you lose 30% of it for the comeback, that is a really bad number that you don't ever want to see happen. And even though they teased it, I think because of that, word of mouth is still pretty strong at this point in time. The newsletters are out. I think they got so afraid by seeing those dips in attendance. And it's not just that the Madison Square Garden house dipped. It's all their net markets that they were in. The first match that Hogan and Flair ever had against each other, do you know what city it took place in? It's really random.
Halifax, Nova Scotia.
No, it's in the United States. Dayton, Ohio. Yeah, I don't know why they chose that to be ground zero for Hogan Flair, but that's what they chose. And when they came back to that,
why not do it in Charlotte? You know, do it in Los Angeles, or fucking Dayton, Ohio. Sure, makes sense. Yeah, and I don't know why that was chosen, but the numbers in that market dipped the second time out. The numbers everywhere dipped for the rematch. That means there's no interest, which is insane when you think about, I remember being a kid and always seeing Pro Wrestling Illustrated on the rack, and I can't count how many times they would have the poster of Hogan and Flair or do a special NWA versus WWF issue where they compared everybody. And that should have been the biggest match in history. And it wasn't. And it wasn't even close. So I'm still building towards that, but here's what I'm not doing. And maybe I'm cheating a little bit because hindsight is 20/20. But even then, I don't want these two guys in a singles match before that. Right.
I don't want to give that away to anybody, whether it's in Dayton, Ohio, or Halifax, Nova Scotia, or New York City. I don't want anyone anywhere to see this match before WrestleMania. And what I have them do is what they did with Hogan and the Warrior with Pat Patterson, like you said. They had Hogan drill this match with the Warrior so Warrior would know when to hit his spots, know what he had to do. I make sure those two get in there, get their asses in gear, and check their egos at the door. And they put on, if it's not the greatest match in the world, it doesn't need to be. It needs to make a lot of money. I don't give a damn about the rematch. This is the match you need to make the money on.
Just want to point something out here. In 1994, when they finally do get to this, how many years later now? We're in 90. What are we? 91 at this point.
Well, we're right now booking April 92, but they first met in October of 91.
Okay. Either way, in 1994,
you're in July 94.
Bash at the Beach, when Hogan and Flair do this thing in WCW, 14,000 in the Orlando Arena in Orlando, Florida. I mean, come on.
And that's 14,000 paid. That's 14,000 paid. WCW wasn't doing anywhere near close to those numbers in any arena, and I think that arena is only like a 16,000 seat capacity arena.
I'm just looking like the following year, 95,000 in Huntington Beach, California. The one with Dennis Rodman, 1997, 8,000 people, and I'm rounding up. I'm being generous.
Yeah.
I mean, get the fuck out of here. So, all right. So we're building toward. So as you said, we are. We basically tell them, look, here's what's going to happen. You're going to work with Pat. We're going to drill this thing, and no one's going to see this thing. Your match doesn't see the light of day until WrestleMania, and if you don't like it, Haku's going to kill you. Go.
Basically where I'm at with that, yeah. So now you have to build them. At the same time, I don't want to lose sight of the Warrior, who really this is about. And so my likelihood is I'm going to do some kind of gimmickry with Warrior and Sid. Because that's the one match I kind of strayed away from. When we first broke them up, I thought Hogan would work with Sid, Warrior would work with Undertaker. Then I have Warrior transitioning to Jake. I feel like if Hogan Flair is the dream match that people may get roped into, may not get roped into, Warrior Sid is that match you see on the poster that's going to rope the casual guy in to want to watch. He's familiar with the Warrior based on this time, and everything that the Warrior's done and accomplished. He sees maybe he sees Sid for the first time because he doesn't watch the NWA, and he sees this guy who physically dwarfs the Warrior. And you can have Sid beat down the Warrior on TV, have Warrior cut promos about, I lost my belt. This guy is bigger. He's strong. He may be stronger. I don't know, but I'm going to give it everything I got. And you build to Warrior versus Sid, and Sid's out of the company after this match anyway. So Warrior goes over and looks strong. Hogan and Flair, you have to be careful with how you're booking because you can't lose interest. They have to maintain some type of contact but not have a match. You can book them in tag team matches. Hogan teams up with not necessarily the Warrior because you want to kind of keep them away from each other now after SummerSlam. Hogan can team up with Roddy Piper, and they can wrestle Flair and Jake. But you never put Hogan and Flair in the ring at the same time together. You carefully avoid that, or maybe you only do a spot where Jake's in control of Hogan, Hogan's beat down, tags to Flair, Flair comes in, stomps him a little bit, punches him, tags right back out to Jake. And Flair's not back in until Piper's in. And you do little instances like that, or maybe, to build heat for the angle, maybe like 2 weeks before WrestleMania, Hulk is doing a match on Superstars, which is rare. He's wrestling some, whoever, somebody lower on the card, IRS. I keep throwing him out there. Well, Flair comes and attacks Hulk's knee with a chair and tries to set him up for easy pickings for the figure four for WrestleMania. Or maybe he does it a month in advance and you take Hogan off TV and you do these vignettes of Hogan doing leg presses and squats in the gym, telling Flair, you knocked me down a peg, but now I'm determined to come back stronger than ever. You've been calling my name for 10 years. I've been calling your name for 10 years. And guess what? This is where it ends. I'm going to prove that I'm the wrestler that you claim to be. And, you go back and forth with all that. You get to there. Hogan goes over. He has to. I just don't see any scenario where Hulk can't go over there. I think if you put Flair over in that scenario, you piss away thousands upon millions of dollars. And I know it's going to irk some people to hear that, but
no, I'm good with this because if you put Hulk over, and then this is '92, he's going to leave in '93, and I think he's going to leave in '92.
Mm-hmm. Because if you remember, the Sid match was supposed to be the retirement match. Right. And part of that is because of this looming thing coming called the steroid trial.
Right.
But what I think you can do here is you have your dream match. There's going to be a cool-off period in the interim. I still think Hulk, if he wanted to, could have lasted till SummerSlam. Because if Warrior was able to last till SummerSlam of '92, then the heat on the steroid trial wasn't as bad as people would have you think.
Right.
And I think what you could do is this is your build eventually towards the new generation.
Right. I was going to say, I'm looking up Yokozuna. I'm trying to figure out when he comes in. Because, look, but between 92 and 93, there's a bunch of guys coming in that you still can put in the places that they are. Yokozuna can still be your big monster heel. You can, if you transition the title from Hogan back to the Warrior or put somebody in between, a couple of things need to happen between 92 and 93. You need to elevate Bret. That still needs to happen. Warrior,
Shawn.
You still keep it Warrior. You keep at the top of the card. You elevate Shawn. Yokozuna's your big monster heel. You keep the Undertaker floating in and out as a monster attraction. These are all things that happen, and so when the bottom falls out and a lot of your bodies go away because of the steroid trial, you still have a good base. I don't think you see the lean years that you see in 94 and 95 if things stay on track and you don't abuse the Warrior and not pay him.
And I think Well, and I think the major step that we would probably agree that should be taken that wasn't taken is they didn't mix in the younger up-and-coming stars with the established stars anywhere near enough to give them that credibility of having rubbed elbows with these guys. It just came to a point where Hogan's gone, Warrior's gone. The only real top established guy to mix elbows or rub elbows with the younger guys was Randy Savage and Ric Flair.
Right. So look, if between 92 and 93, the writing's on the wall, the federal government's coming at you and you have time to prepare, number one. Number two, you don't abuse the Warrior. You have a transition point. Because even if the Warrior takes off when he does in late 92, because, dude, you're on so much gas that if the federal government sniffs you, we're going to go out of business. And he has to go. If that, we said the story ends at WrestleMania 8. If it really does end at Survivor Series, ceremoniously, not unceremoniously, if basically they're like, you're losing and we're writing you off television because you're on crazy amounts of steroids, that's fine. But you have between WrestleMania 8 and Survivor Series to work a proper transition, and and again, you start to elevate some of these guys. There's a handing off of the baton going into 93 that doesn't end in WrestleMania 9 and subsequently King of the Ring 93, which is embarrassing.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that hurt the credibility of, say, Bret Hart, who they really wanted to establish as their new, not necessarily their new Hogan, but their new guy that they're going with the head of the new generation, never worked with any of those guys. He worked with Flair, but it was a match that Flair claims was bad because he had, an inner ear problem that causes vertigo, and so he couldn't give Bret a good match to drop the title to him. Secondly, that the match was so random.
I was going to say, it was off TV in Saskatchewan.
But yeah, because it was supposed to have been on TV. It was supposed to have aired on Primetime Wrestling, but they weren't happy with, or at least I could say Vince and Pat Patterson weren't happy with the quality of the match. Flair apparently, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say it's true, he claims he has an inner ear problem where a piece of calcium had chipped off in his ear years ago, and every so often it causes him to have bouts of vertigo. And he said that's what happened when he worked with Bret for this particular match. Bret has said that he just didn't gel well with Flair at all, that Flair would do things he didn't expect during the match and couldn't brace himself for. And there was actually video of Flair kicking him off of a spinning toe hold and Bret not expecting it. And because of how he lands in the ropes, he dislocates two of his fingers and he pops them back into place. And Kurt Hennig at ringside grimaces in pain looking at it.
Yeah, in the world where we're running things and we're not letting people with ADHD run the company, first of all, that doesn't happen in Saskatchewan. They build towards Flair and Bret. They are able to work off camera to make sure none of that shit happens anyway. And they have their match proper at a pay-per-view, whether it's Survivor Series 92 or whatever, or the Royal Rumble.
You mix a guy like Bret in more, in scenarios where he teams up with Warrior or he teams up with Hulk and faces two top heels together. And you don't do it where Bret at random comes out of the blue and is all of a sudden a world championship level guy. And I'm not saying they really did. They did a decent job of having him work his way up the ranks, which is why a lot of fans loved him. he was a tag team champion, Intercontinental champion, King of the Ring, moved up gradually and worked towards it. But it lacked something because he wasn't mixed in with those top guys, except for, very minimal interaction with Savage.
Well, look at the Survivor Series 92 card. I don't know who booked this, but they should be shot in the kneecap. You have, you have for the world title, you have Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels, which years later, sure, not 1992 though. And then you have the real main event, which was horseshit, where you have Savage and what was supposed to be the Warrior versus Razor and Ric Flair. How is that not Ric Flair and Bret Hart for the title? Like, if you know you're going into, you know what I mean? Like I don't want to book it now because we need to bring this to a close. But
yeah,
once Hulk goes over Flair at Mania, you have to build the SummerSlam. You have to transition the title, either back to Warrior or to Flair or some amalgamation of that, so that by Survivor Series, you get to either by Survivor Series or by the Royal Rumble, you have to get to Flair versus Bret Hart in a proper main event. And that's a whole other – we can talk about that another day. But that's the point of this, is that there was too much cold feet, too much not keeping their eye on the ball, and obviously a lot of, as I said before, a lot of unprofessional behavior on the part of the office. But to bring this to a close, this is why, in a nutshell, the Warriors title run did not work out. We have laid out all the evidence. We have supported it with facts. We have shown you an alternative to where they actually could have made money. And so a lot of the arguments about, we're talking about like, well, the business was down. In a world where these things that we're talking about actually happen, maybe business isn't as bad. Maybe it even stays level or gets better. It's hard to say because there's so many mistakes that get made between 1990 and 92 that you often wonder how this company didn't go out of business. I came close to 95, but it does make your head shake with shame.
And to be fair, again, we're booking this in hindsight, where we have certain advantages that the creative team then obviously didn't. I think for the most part, though, I think we're pretty fair in laying out things that it doesn't take hindsight to see probably would have worked better than what was actually laid out, and probably were more fair in a lot of ways to not just the talent, but to the people investing in the product itself, the fans. And listen, I watched the entirety of the WWF as it was. I feel like this scenario that we brought up tonight, or multiple scenarios for that matter, were all superior to what we actually got. And again, just one man's opinion, maybe two if we're counting Mark now, because I don't know if Mark's totally on board with what I suggested as being
I'm good with
a better alternative. Okay.
It's not like you're like trailing, and then RoboCop comes in. You're not saying stupid shit like that. It's not like, and Sting came over. No, come on. If he didn't come over in real life, he wasn't coming over in any scenario that we came up with. We used people that did come over. We used viable options for people who were available at the time. So barring injuries that we couldn't possibly predict, there's no reason why any of these things couldn't happen. This is a matter, in my opinion, of force of will, bravery, and professionalism. And I think that above all is the story of why the Ultimate Warrior fails, is there's a lot of unprofessional behavior, there's a lot of lack of will, and there's a lot of fear. I think Vince McMahon was way too dependent on Hogan. And I think there's fear of Vince McMahon when nobody wanted to tell him, hey, you're a crazy person, don't do this.
Well, and I think that fear is bolstered by probably a couple things we didn't necessarily point out. Failures in outside ventures, like things like the World Bodybuilding Federation. His forays into attempting to be a boxing promoter, where he promoted the Ray Leonard, Donnie Lalonde pay-per-view that didn't necessarily go anywhere. Trying to get a foothold in Atlantic City with Donald Trump. He had so many failed ventures outside of WWE and what worked, that I really think he, as you said, became way too dependent solely on Hulk and what Hulk could do as top guy, and that when it was time to change things up and go in another direction, he not only really didn't know how to do that properly, he didn't really necessarily want to. You know, we can talk about Vince as a guy who doesn't necessarily listen to his fans, and let's point to Roman Reigns as an evidence of that. But I think even as a businessman who's taking a lot of risks, he's still not a huge risk taker in that regard.
Well, no, I will tell you this. Vince McMahon is a guy with a lot of imagination, but it's so funny because people criticize. This is really the last statement I'm going to make on this, and then we need to transition out. People pick on Vince Russo and say, "There's a guy with a lot of creativity, but boy, does he need editing." Well, so does Vince. Vince wants to give you a football league that puts the fun back in football and gives you everything, all the sizzle about football with no football. There's no guy with details about how football works. Like if you watch the XFL 30 for 30, they blatantly say that they created this entire marketing package for a product that didn't exist yet. And I'm looking at my wife, and we both come to the same conclusion, like nobody goes and gets a football consultant and says, hey, we need somebody whose only job is to create the football product. None of that exists because they're so busy worrying about marketing this thing and creating, and creating this product to sell that nobody looks at the details. So again, Vince McMahon, very creative, very driven, obviously, very personality disordered. But the other problem with him is he is not detail-oriented at all. It's like the details bore him, which it often does with geniuses. But there needed to be somebody who was like, okay, Vince, I get your vision. And now you need somebody who's detail-oriented, who's really going to get into the finer points to make it happen. And there are probably some people around him, obviously, because, he could not exist without this. But I don't think there's enough of that, and I don't think those people have enough force of will to tell Vince when he's gone off the fucking deep end.
No, the only one who ever did was Pat Patterson. He is the only one who was ever enough to say, Vince, we can't do this. This isn't going to work. You have to have this, and this when going from point A to point B. You can't just go A to B without these pit stops along the way. And to his credit, Vince respected Pat enough to listen to him when it came to these things. You've had other guys booking for Vince who never had the wherewithal to say these things to him. And as a result, when things don't go right, Vince looks at them and goes, you're fired. Guys like George Scott, who came over in the mid-'80s during the initial boom and was very successful. And then when things slowed up and George, started contracting Alzheimer's and couldn't remember telling Vince no to anything, George got sacked. A guy like Jerry Jarrett, who Vince was bringing in as a potential replacement when the steroid trial happened. Jerry would, claim one idea at the time, and then Vince would say, okay, that's great, champ. Let's go with it, pal. And then when it didn't work out, Jerry would tell him, well, I said this, and Vince would flat out tell him, no, you didn't. And Bruce Pritchard hates Jerry Jarrett for the same reason, where Jerry tries to take credit for everything and take none of the blame for what didn't work, just like Vince Russo. And there's not enough Pat Pattersons in this world to really expand Vince's, plots into the details. He doesn't have the Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak to his Bill Gates more often than not.
And we're probably going to come back to that point a lot as we do more of these podcasts over time. The next one we'd like to do at some point, and this isn't one of my podcasts where they're going to be strictly scheduled. We're going to do these as we have ideas and time permits. Pat's a busy guy. I'm a busy guy. So we will do them as the calendar permits, time warrants, and there's interest. I think that's fair. I do know that we do have one we want to talk about, and we will plan it soon. So look for that. It's going to be, again, why the Flair run in the WWF also not so good, didn't work out. We'll come up with a snappier title. And we've got a short list of other things we want to talk about, but that'll be revealed over time. I want to thank Pat for doing this with me tonight. I thought this was going to be a 90-minute discussion. We've nearly gone 3 hours. So I think we have talked more on the Radulich and Broadcasting Network about the Ultimate Warrior than anybody has, including his own family, in life.
Well, you asked me to book from WrestleMania 4 to WrestleMania 8. That takes some time.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of ground to cover. So, did you enjoy yourself tonight, though?
I had a blast. I'm not sure. So the funny thing with me is I'm generally more in the line of Vince McMahon as a big idea guy, and I don't necessarily meticulously plot details. But I feel like I had a good base to work off of with how much attention I paid to the product at the time and how much I've still followed up on all the details and the years that have come. And I don't know. I have an issue where I retain a lot of stuff about this, and I throw out other stuff like math. I don't know how that works.
Well, I think we put your special gifts to use tonight. So I thought this was a great discussion. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. Pat's going to be with me again in a slightly more condensed conversation. Because if it's like this, I don't know what we're going to do. But that's going to be in about 2 weeks or so. He's going to be on TV Party Tonight, February 28th. We're going to talk the first season, 10 episodes of Dennis Leary's Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll. And then he's going to go away for a little bit, and he'll come back in April for Rome Week here on the Radulich and Broadcasting Network, where because Pat made me, we're going to review The Way of the Dragon. And we'll talk more about that when it gets a little bit closer. Pat, is there anything else you want to plug before we hit the road, Jack?
Yeah, Mark, are you still on the Twitter machine?
I am still on the Twitter machine at Mark Radulich.
I'm going to steal an idea from our friends Bruce and Conrad, a.k.a. Gavin. And if there is a particular topic that you would like for Mark and I to discuss, please send feedback to Mark on his Twitter, as I do not have a Twitter anymore. But it's at Mark Radulich, just like Radulich and Broadcasting Network. If there is a particular topic you're interested in hearing about, or if you hear us throw out some possible topics, which we'll probably do over the next few weeks on Facebook, we'll gauge your interest in what you want to hear about and just let us know with some feedback.
You can also contact me through the Radulich and Broadcasting Facebook page. I'm on Messenger on Facebook, Mark Radulich, LCSW. So, look, anywhere you can find me, send me a message. We've had fans over the last couple of years of the Radulich and Broadcasting Network contact me directly, and some of them went on to have their own shows. So I couldn't be more open, people. We've had some super fans make some suggestions. We've done those shows. We are very user-friendly here. So with that said, real quick, next week, we've got Batman 66, Volume 1 on Source Material, Chef's Table, Season 1 on TV Party Tonight, If He Dies, Beneath the Waves on the MHOD, and finally, we're going to put Ye Olde Catwoman on trial. It's going to be hilarious. Sean Comer and I we'll have a fun discussion of Ye Olde Catwoman, and I will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, to all the naysayers that there is something savable about that movie. I don't quite know what yet, but it will be. God damn it. By God. So with that said, I want to thank you all for, if you stuck with it this long in the archives, God bless you. And, because we hit the 2-hour mark and then, we had to go into record mode. But if you stuck with the 2-hour live version, oof, what a fan you are, and we appreciate you. So with that said, for Pat Mullin, be well, be safe, and behave.